exist, there's a chapter and a paragraph number. So in this first one, you're going to see Robert's Rules of Order, and in parentheses, I have RONR, 12th edition, 50:1. What that stands for is the 50th chapter, the first paragraph. It's easier to find information in the book that way. I'm pretty excited about the change. But just to let you know, if it's not matching up with your book that you may have on hand, that's why. Most of it's the same. They've just made a few changes. And so I think if you have a copy of Robert's Rules of Order 11th edition, you can still find most everything that we're going to talk about tonight. All right. So the definition of a committee. A committee, as understood in parliamentary law, is a body of one or more persons elected or appointed by or by direction of an assembly or society to consider, investigate, or to take action on certain matters or subjects, or to do all of these things. And again, that's found in Robert's Rules of Order, chapter 50 in paragraph 1. Notice that it says a committee is a body of one or more persons. So when we're talking about a committee, we're talking about a smaller group of people. If you have an organization that's 100 people or 50, anywhere in between, there are organizations. I've done work for organizations that are 1,400 people on the floor, and they're all ready to discuss things and go to microphones and so on. So all kinds of organizations that are of different size. However, I would say that if you have an organization that starts getting to be a dozen or more people, a lot of times committee work is very, very convenient. Once the bigger the organization gets, the more important committees become. So when we're talking about a committee, we're talking about a body that is set aside by the organization to look at specific subjects, to do research, to do analysis on a subject that may come up. So I don't, Ms. Terry, I don't know if I'm supposed to be, the chats are coming up in front of me. I don't know if I'm supposed to address those. I'll wait for your prompting before I stop and answer any questions.
Right, you keep going.
Okay, thank you. So a committee is a smaller group. Again, if you have an organization that's say 50 people, we're talking about a group of people set aside for a committee that may be 3 to 5. I'm just picking those numbers just to give you an example. Depending on the work the committee is going to do, then what you're going to need is that'll determine the size of your committee and who's going to be staffing that committee. But again, one thing to keep in mind when you're trying to form a committee as an organization is that the job for that group is research and analysis. That's what they're going to be doing. So they're elected or appointed by the next line. They're elected or appointed by or by direction of an assembly or a society. So when you have an NPU, when you have a national plan, not a national, neighborhood planning unit, you've got a whole room full of people. That group of people typically and generally would select the committee and who would be on the committee. The committee, and different organizations work in different ways. Some organizations say that the chairperson is going to pick who's going to be working on all the committees. Some organizations say that the chairperson is going to do the nominating, and then the membership will vote, and so on. So there's different ways of doing it. But in common practice, in most common practice, depending on whoever decides who the committee is going to be, a committee of the NPU is going to answer and report to the NPU. That's how that works. Now, if you have a board of directors with a particular NPU, and that board of directors has set aside a committee, and that happens, that's possible, then that committee would report to the board of directors. But what we're talking about tonight primarily is committee work as it relates to the membership. So what a committee is supposed to do, we're just going to take this one step at a time, because I don't know what you know and what you don't know. And so if I'm sounding too elementary, please accept my apologies, but there may be some people that's hearing this information for the first time. And so we'll take it one step at a time. when you have the organization who has set aside a committee, that committee will do its research, it'll do its analysis. If you have a bylaws committee, if you have a finance committee, those are the things they'll look at. The committee that's set aside for whatever subject that they're responsible for, they will do that research, they will do that analysis, and then they will come back and they will provide information, recommendations to the organization.
Mr. Dennis, quick question.
Yes,
while you're
ma'am.
on committees, Jim Martin asks, can you be a member of a standing committee of a body if you are not a member of the body itself?
You can, but it has to be agreed upon by the body, and or it has to be included in the governing documents. But there are organizations that will bring in certain experts to be members of their committees who are not members of the organization itself. So that's allowable according to procedure. But again, I'll repeat it, the organization has to approve it ultimately, either by the governing documents or by vote. That's a good question. That's a good question. Committee work, and when we're talking about committee work, we're not talking about something that's minor. We're not talking about something that is just take it or leave it. Committee work is very, very important to an organization. There are organizations that have made determinations in their governing documents that if, for example, if there's a committee that's we'll just use budget committee. We'll keep it simple. If there's a budget committee in place, then any motion, there are some organizations that will say any motion that is moved and seconded that's going to be dealing with finance, it will automatically be sent to the committee for that committee to work on that subject and come back and bring a report and so on. And we'll talk about what takes place after that in a little bit. But so the reason I bring that up is because when we're talking about committee work, it's not something to shrug off. It's not just something that, you know, you can use a committee if you want, if you don't want. It's so much more than that. So that takes me to the next place, the practicality of a committee. Before I go any further, I'm just going to go ahead and pause. Ms. Terry, are there any questions at this point that you think we should stop and answer?
Since you're on this, Ms. Rhoda Bronner asked, could you explain the difference between standing committee and a special committee? Is the nominating committee a standing committee or a special committee? And actually it was 3 questions. Okay.
One at a time.
Right.
Let's do the first one. So a standing committee is a committee that's in place permanently. And I'll try to illustrate it like this. Let's say you have a finance committee, a bylaws committee, and you have a program committee that brings in speakers and entertainment, just depending on your organization. So let's say you have all those, and these are standing committees. Because of the organization, they're going to keep those committees in place forever, and they'll change the membership as time goes on, you know, according to the bylaws, however it's set up, usually annually or semi-annually, so, or biannually, pardon me. So that's the arrangement with standing committees. You've got those 3 categories, for example. With a special committee, let's say that same organization, somebody makes a motion to purchase a couple of vans, travel vans for the organization, or there's no committee that's set aside for that. There's no committee that looks into transportation for that organization. So what that organization might do is it might, on the spot, and it can take place right on the spot when somebody says we want to take a look at purchasing some vans, they would establish a committee right on the spot. And there's a way to do that. There's procedure to do that. And that committee would be given, it would be called an ad hoc or a special committee. And it would be given the responsibility to do the research, to look into the feasibility of purchasing some vans. And they would come back after they did all the work and research, and they would come back and they would report their findings to the organization. Because that organization isn't always working on transportation. Once that committee is done, then they dissolve. They've done their work. They've researched the vans, Chevy, Ford, Toyota. What do you want to get? What color? What wheels and tires and so on. And so then they report. The organization decides, and then the committee's done. The latter one I just described, that's a special committee for special cases that come up in the organization.
And actually, the last 2 questions are based on they really depend on the bylaws of the organization. So yeah. So it was only one question.
Just the one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the practicality of a committee. And I'll just, this is another quote out of Robert's Rules of Order. As a matter of fact, it's the same paragraph, an excerpt out of the next paragraph. I'm sorry, the following paragraph. Although the term committee commonly implies a relatively small number of persons appointed to give a task more detailed attention than is possible in a body the size of an assembly, that's a long sentence. This characteristic more accurately describes what are known as ordinary committees. So it's often too cumbersome for an organization to look at details of a budget, for example. Can you imagine in your NPU, even on a given night when you meet and everybody's gathered, the whole room is full, and you don't have a budget committee, and maybe you don't, maybe you do. I'm not trying to be negative in any way here, but I picked this example because when you're talking about doing a budget for most organizations, you're talking about a lot of detail and you're talking about a lot of work. So I can't imagine an organization that is of any size that has, say, an office with some staff and maybe make some purchases and so on. I can't imagine an organization like that not having a budget. So as it has a budget, imagine the organization itself, the membership meeting and trying to hammer out the various details of the office and the budget and the particulars that go into spending money, making money and spending money. Y'all would be, the organization would be there days on end trying to work out those details. And it's just impractical. It's just cumbersome. And it's just way too much. So most organizations, as you were involved with various organizations, they will have a budget committee. That budget committee, what they do is they take a look at the budget, they gauge it, they watch it, they do the research, they do the analysis, they do their best to answer questions as they come up from the organization. And once a year, that budget committee will take its findings, and we're gonna come up to this step pretty often in our discussion because this is an important part of it. It takes its findings and it goes to the body and then reports the recommendations to the body. That's the genius of committee work. The organization itself shouldn't have to decide on how much paper to buy for the printer. It shouldn't have to decide what colored pencils to buy. It shouldn't have to decide what copier it's going to purchase or what desk it's going to get or a chair. That's beyond. It's too cumbersome. It's too specific for an organization to deal with the membership. So I picked budget committee, but bylaws committee is the same way. I know that with NPUs there's zoning committees, and zoning committees would do a lot of the detail work that the body itself would spend a whole lot of time trying to do if it took it on itself. And so that's the important part of doing committee work. It is put into place to do the more detailed. They're doing the footwork. You know, a budget committee would study the previous budget. It would study the cost analysis of the different products that it has to buy. It would get reports from the directors of the departments and so on and so on. Just way too much for the membership as a whole to try to tackle. So any questions? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop after every section here and see if there are any questions for those who are in attendance.
So Dennis, there aren't questions in the chat, but I can chime in with one if you don't mind elaborating. I think the committee that is most that the NPUs can relate to the most would be the zoning committee and the work that is done there. Would you mind talking a little bit about the benefit of doing the work in the zoning committee as opposed to vetting, discussing, debating applications during the general body meeting?
Yes, I'd be glad to, Ms. LaRue, Ms. Terry, or any others. As you know, as you understand, because I don't attend the NPU meetings very often, I don't know the parameters of the work of a zoning committee specifically, but I can certainly speak to that generally. The work that an NPU zoning committee is going to be involved in. They're considering, I'm supposing, Ms. LaRue, they're considering questions on rezoning neighborhoods and certain parts of neighborhoods and communities, and whether it's going to be a certain rating, whether it's going to be residential, business, or combination, or so on. And help me if I'm not understanding that properly. But when you're talking about zoning, you're talking about the different people and neighbors and organizations and residents that are going to be involved and affected. That is way too much work for a particular membership of an NPU to do in a membership meeting. There's just so much knowledge to accumulate and so much analysis to accomplish that I would highly recommend that you engage, if you haven't engaged, if you're an NPU and you haven't engaged a zoning committee, a smaller group of individuals who are set aside to do that analysis, do that research, and look at the statutes and the city code and various things that apply and the concerns of the citizens involved. Boy, you need that kind of specificity tackled and handled on the committee level. And then once they do that work, then they can come back and report to the organization, to the NPU as a whole, their findings, their recommendations, and so on. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do at that point. We're not quite there yet. Maybe it's coming up in a little bit, but Ms. LaRue, I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. Thank you, Dennis. I think that was very helpful. I know that many of the NPUs, so many certainly do utilize their zoning committees to do the heavy lifting, the research.
Yes.
Researching the code, researching previous cases, researching the application itself. I've seen some do drive-bys and take pictures of the property that is, that the application applies to. I've seen all kinds of deep work that zoning committees do. And I've also seen the opposite of the spectrum where NPUs don't have strengthened zoning committees. And so they end up doing that work during the general body meeting, which can take hours. I see James nodding his head, he gets it. It can definitely take hours to try to answer all the questions from the community, Google the answers, make calls to try to figure out how to answer these questions. So you did answer the question, and I appreciate the clarity and the encouragement for NPUs to definitely focus on building up those zoning committees. Thank you, Dennis.
Absolutely. And Leah, what you brought up really works to the point as far as specifics are concerned. So let's suppose an NPU really hasn't engaged a zoning committee to do that specific work. The pictures that you're talking about, members of the committee going by and taking pictures, talking to neighborhoods and so on like that, neighbors, and looking at the applications, looking at the zoning laws and so on in the city, even of the state. Can you imagine trying to accomplish that in a meeting, in a membership meeting? Are we going to raise our hands and say, let's appoint so-and-so and so-and-so to run out real quick and take pictures and to go talk to the neighbors? We'll wait for you. That's absurd. Of course, that's not going to happen. But again, the value, the high value in this case, what we're talking about is for an NPU to utilize a zoning committee. The high value in that effort.
Yeah, I also want to point out that to give credit where it's due, Nick Hess, the chair of NPUS, raised a very important point that I usually speak quite a bit about. I don't know how I managed to overlook it this time, but indeed, the greatest danger in not having a zoning committee that is vetting these applications or that even understands how to vet them and what questions to ask. The real danger is that the NPU will either blow past it, to use Nick's words, and just vote without having the information that they need, or I've seen even a hyper focus on superficial qualities or characteristics like the color of the paint, for example, or the lettering of the signage or the placement of the trash bin or things like that. And it's clear that sometimes these discussions are happening because there's just a lack of understanding of what to really focus on. Um, so it is important to build out a zoning committee. And if I may plug it in right here, we do have 3 this year, 3 zoning fundamentals courses in MPU University
Oh,
that really
perfect.
help
Yeah,
identify. Yeah, it really helps people figure out how to vet those applications, what kinds of questions to ask, what to look for, and how to discuss these applications and even zoning code amendments in their zoning committees.
that's perfect. That's perfect. Are there other questions that would pertain to what we've dealt with so far? All right. As parliamentarians like to say, seeing none, we'll proceed. The authority of the committee. Okay, that I just saw a question pop up, but I don't think that's for me. So the authority of a committee. Generally, the term committee implies that within the area of its assigned responsibilities, the committee has less authority to act independently for society or other constituting power than a board is usually understood to have. So that's pretty important. So I'm going to read the next line, and these are my words. That was a quote from Robert's Rules, 12th edition. It came out of 50th chapter in the 4th paragraph. The next line after that quote says, note that the committee does not necessarily act independently of the organization. So the committee is not deciding, and this is important. This is important. We're talking about, and Ms. LaRue has brought up the zoning committee and how important it is for the NPUs to have a well-functioning zoning committee. And I can't help but to agree fully, especially given the work that an NPU is set to do. So, but the zoning committee itself, understand, and whether we're talking about zoning committee, budget committee, bylaws committee, grounds, grounds committee, the building and facilities committee. The committee itself doesn't make decisions for the body. The committee itself isn't deciding for the body. That's important. The committee is going to do a bunch of work. They're going to meet. Sometimes you're going to have late nights. Maybe not always. Depends on the way the committee works and the work that they do. But we just described, or Ms. LaRue just described, how the committee, some members of the committee, they're going by, they're taking pictures and they're looking over documents, they're looking over application forms, they're researching what the laws say, maybe even consulting an attorney. And so they're doing all that hard work. And after they do all that hard work, it's real easy to come to a conclusion and think, okay, we got it figured out. We know exactly what our NPU is supposed to do. We're all proud of our work, and we should be. We're all excited about our accomplishments, and we should be. And when we come to conclusions based on the research and analysis that we hold, that we conduct, we're going to come to certain conclusions. And what the committee will do is the committee will vote on the different questions. It should. It will vote on the different questions that come up in relation to a particular request. Let's say a zoning request. So it's deciding by way of vote, even as a committee. So after it goes to all that trouble there and all that work, it's important to understand that the committee then will take those ideas and they will present them to the body to decide what should be done. So the committee isn't deciding for the organization. There are certain situations where a committee will be granted power, and sometimes it's a legal action, that not action, but it's a legal decision that has to take place at a certain level for a nonprofit or others to grant that kind of authority to a committee. But sometimes there is a power to act on behalf of the organization granted to a committee, but that's not the common arrangement. Most committees and the experiences that you're going to have, that I'm going to have, probably are simply geared toward doing research and making recommendations. Now, one example I could provide for you and is the city council. There are 7 committees that are set aside by council members, each committee being populated by various council members. Those are high-end committees for the city. They're doing a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of analysis, but they in themselves they don't make decisions on behalf of the city council. What you'll see in a city council meeting is a chairperson giving reports of their respective committee, and they will make a motion to pass certain legislation or whatever other recommendation is being provided. And then the council itself will make a decision. Sometimes they change the legislation. Sometimes they change the recommendations. But again, just to stress the point, the committee isn't deciding for the NPU. The committee is doing the research and making recommendations. Is basically just saying, this is what we think. We've done the work, we've done the research, this is what we think ought to be, this is what we recommend ought to be decided. So I'm going to read the last line on the first page. Once the organization hears the report of the committee, the assembly can handle the recommendations any way it sees fit. And I just alluded to that with the city council. It can adopt it, it can amend it, it can reject it, or it can send it back to the committee. So let's suppose where an NPU is concerned, let's suppose that the NPU has a zoning committee. That zoning committee goes and does all the work and the research and the analysis, comes back, and in a regular NPU meeting, it's time for committee reports, and the zoning committee makes its report on a particular application, zoning application. And so they make the report. And they've done a lot of work, they've done a lot of research, and boy, they've been thorough and they've been good at it. And so the NPU membership, they're so impressed, they like everything they hear, they agree with the assessment of the zoning committee, and they adopt it. They adopt the recommendation and go on to do other business, easy peasy. Let's suppose that the zoning committee does a lot of work, and as the membership is listening, a couple people have a couple of questions, which is legitimate. So they'll ask after the zoning committee gives its report, a couple people will raise their hand, one at a time, of course. They'll raise their hand, they'll say, well, what about so-and-so? I know just down the street, there's a this type of business, or there's a church, or there's a liquor store, or there's a who knows what, there's a factory. And so they'll raise those questions. And then as people begin to raise questions, as people begin to talk about those questions and those subjects, they may change the report a little bit. In other words, the zoning committee has particular recommendations. Well, the NPU membership listening to those recommendations may change them a little bit. They may amend them. And then once they amend them, then they may adopt them. That's a possibility as well. It may be that the NPU membership listens to those recommendations, and be ready for this one. And there should be no hurt feelings. There should be no, it's a professional action. The committee reports to the membership. The membership has the final say in its own organization. As far as I can tell, with the bylaws that I've looked at, there may be 1 or 2 exceptions, but I would ask Ms. LaRue and Ms. Terry to speak to that if that's true with any of the NPUs. But as it stands, in my understanding, the membership of the NPU has final say in its own affairs. And again, recognizing full well that what the NPU is doing is just making recommendations to the council. So be that as it may, let's suppose that a zoning committee comes up, they've done the work, they've done the research, they've analyzed it, and they're making recommendations to the membership. The membership starts asking questions, and they start asking more questions, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's time to vote, and it doesn't pass. The recommendations for the zoning committee, it failed to get a majority vote. Be prepared for that. And that's okay, because you did your work, you did your research. And what you did, if nothing else, is you made the job of the NPU membership a whole lot easier by the work that you did. They didn't have to sort through and go through and take pictures and interview neighbors and and so on and so on and so on. They couldn't do all that, but it's still their decision. It's still the membership's decision. So if you're on a committee and you do all the work, and then you recommend approval, and then after questions are asked, discussion ensues, you don't get a majority vote, try not to get hurt feelings. Try not to say, well, they don't respect us. Try not to say, well, fine, I'll just quit the committee. I'll let somebody else do it. Try not to go there, because even if it's rejected, your work was vital in them having the proper and good information, enough information to know how to decide for themselves. Because remember, I feel like I'm a little long-winded here, but I'm doing it on purpose, because this is a sore spot in some organizations. A committee's excited about a proposal and then it doesn't make a majority vote. And so, but remember, what you're doing as a committee member and as a committee team is you're doing the research for the organization, and you're just a small representation of the full membership. It's the full membership that has to answer for the final decision. It's in their lap. And you say, well, they're making a mistake. That may be, but it's their mistake to make. And I say that to organization after organization after organization. It's their mistake to make. It's not the committee's mistake to make. It's not the chairman's mistake to make. It's not the board of directors' mistake to make. The decision belongs to the membership, right or wrong. So that's important to remember. You may go home that night being a committee member and thinking, man, I don't believe they didn't vote that in. I thought they're messed up. Man, they messed up. I know they should have voted that in. You may be right about that. You may be right about that. But it's their decision to make. It's their mistake to make if indeed they did make a mistake. So important to keep in mind, in my view, and that keeps everybody smiling to the best of their ability, shaking hands, maybe a hug every now and then, and keeping friends friends. You need to be able to agree to disagree in this kind of work. So that's all I'll say about that. Are there questions that pertain to the things that we've talked about so far? I see a lot of things in chat.
Yes.
Terry, but I don't know if that pertains to anything I should answer or not.
Should the NPU use a formal referral process to refer a matter to a committee, or is it sufficient to set out the scope of committee responsibility in the bylaws and not have to go through a referral process, which could be as simple as an email from the chair documenting the referral?
It depends on how you want to set up. Let me lay out two basic approaches that organizations take. We're talking a lot about zoning committees. So assuming that an NPU has a zoning committee and a question comes up on the floor about zoning, and let's say it's nothing that is, there's no application that's being formatted or filled out or anything like that, but the organization, somebody talks, brings up a motion on zoning, and I'm not sure what that would look like. Some organizations would say as soon as that's moved and seconded, it goes to committee. It goes to zoning committee. That has to be in the bylaws. For that to be that way, it has to be in the bylaws. Let's say your finance committee. Let's say an NPU has a finance committee. Somebody raises their hand. I make a motion that we spend money to who knows what, to get everybody nice badges to wear in our meetings. Who knows what? And somebody says, well, I second that. And then the organization, the NPU, may have it in their bylaws. Anything regarding spending money that comes up goes right to the finance committee. So that's one approach. It just depends on how you want to structure. The second approach is that somebody makes a motion that has to do with finance. There's a second, and then you discuss that particular question. And in the middle of that discussion, it is legitimate for somebody to say, I move that we send that to the finance committee, or I move that we send that to the zoning committee. That's seconded, that's discussed, and then voted on. And if there's a majority vote, then the motion is called to commit or to send to committee, to refer to committee. If that passes, then that automatically goes to committee. So it's one of two ways. You're either voting on the particular question in the meeting, or else you're already set up in the bylaws that anything that pertains to that committee's subject matter and what they deal with, it'll automatically go to that. And we're going to talk a little bit about committees, if we haven't already, about setting them up in the bylaws. And maybe that's where we're going next. But before I do, if there are any other questions, if that answered the question, Ms. Terry. I don't hear you.
Sorry. The next question.
Uh, Mr. Conway, I think the question came from Mr. Lal. Mr. Lal, did that answer your question? Mr. Lal?
Well, go to the next question for now.
All right. Next question comes from Dan Choman. Can they send it back to the committee at any time for additional research?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they can. Let's suppose an organization in a membership meeting, the zoning committee brings a recommendation. And then once that recommendation hits the floor, let's say it's a recommendation to approve the application. So questions start being asked, discussion starts taking place. It is in order if it's a main motion, if the proposal has been brought to the membership in the meeting, it is in order. And now we're talking about precedence of motions. We're talking about the ranking of various motions. So what we're talking about is the zoning committee brought a main motion to approve. And you'll see this happen in sometimes in council. So while that's just being discussed, somebody says, I move that we send this back to committee and have them do some more research. The next person says, another person says, I second that. Well, then that's discussed whether or not you want to resend it back to committee. And if that is voted on and it passes, then that proposal from the zoning committee goes back to zoning committee, and they have to do more research as per the instructions of the membership. So yes, it can be recommitted. I just wanted to go into some detail on how that would look.
I believe the next question is from Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, please unmute.
Oh, actually, I didn't raise my hand to read my question in the chat. I raised my hand to point out, and I'm not sure that Dennis is aware of this, but everything that is referred to the MPUs by the city, we're constrained in the time that we have to deal with these things by the city's board meeting calendars. And so things like formally referring to committees is really off the table most of the time because we have to render a decision before we could go back and forth in that way.
So if you're locked into a month's framework, then one cycle, then I would agree. And in my judgment, and I'm not in the inner workings, I'm not in the detailed workings of an NPU and those questions. But boy, if you had to make some recommendations regarding a particular zoning question, I can't imagine one meeting being enough, or one committee meeting being enough. Maybe sometimes it is, and maybe that's something that has to be looked at. I don't know what the council zoning committee can provide for, and I don't know what the code says. That's something maybe we can look up. Maybe Ms. LaRue has the answer to that. But if it's just one cycle, I would say that needs another look, in my judgment, not being in the inner workings.
Okay, that was the last question.
Last question.
That was?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so to establish committee.
Excuse me,
Yes.
me. I was trying to type a question. This Miss Adams. I'm not as quick as you all, but I have a question. If the NPU bylaws states that the applicant should go to the impacted community of the zoning issue, I understand that the committees does recommendations and the general body makes the vote. But if the general body says no and the impacted community says yes, shall both responses go to the city or just the one that comes from the NPU?
It depends on the governing documents. If your governing documents of the NPU provide for for an alternative view based on the community that's impacted, then that would be sufficient. But if the design of the NPU, given whatever NPU it is that the membership of that NPU would vote and make a recommendation to the council, then I would have to say, again, without looking at the documents, I would have to say that the recommendation that goes to council is the recommendation that was expressed by the vote of the NPU. And if that's a continuing discrepancy, in other words, if there is, and I don't want to muddy the waters, Ms. LaRue, Ms. Terry, and others in leadership, but if there's a continued discrepancy between the local residents and businesses on a particular question as compared to what the NPU feels is best, again, that's where a strong committee would be able to bring those two together somehow and work out something. But I, what I understand the NPU's work to be is official recommendations from the neighborhood to the council and committees of council. So again, at first blush, the best I can do is to say, no, the NPU's vote, unless the governing documents have another option or another alternative, the vote of the NPU is what would be sent to council.
Okay, so everyone, going forward with the meetings, please raise your hand or type your question in the chat so that we can try to get through. We're going to get to all the questions at some point. So I believe Mr. Martin's hand is up raised.
Yeah, I had also typed a question in the chat that wasn't related to what I said earlier. Who or how are quorum requirements for committees determined? Is that determined by the committee or by the body as a whole?
It's determined by the body as a whole by designing the committee and putting together the putting into the governing documents what the committee should look like and how it should be staffed, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's not provided, then the default position is that a majority of the committee members constitute a quorum.
So the committee does not have the latitude to define its own quorum?
Not typically. No, not unless it's given permission by the membership, by the organization.
Okay, Miss Gloria Hopkins.
I'm sorry, if I may, can I jump in on
Yes, Ms. LaRue.
I've seen, Jim, I've seen some NPUs have in their bylaws that the quorum of the committee is the majority of the committee, which in theory, I think is safe and works well because, as you know, many of the committees fluctuate in numbers in terms of participation. I did want to point out though, and this is probably more a question for Dennis, some of the committees have very fluid participation, meaning the committee equals whoever showed up that night of the meeting. So the zoning committee in practice, the zoning committee could be the 37 concerned community members who came to the meeting to hear about this particular application, all of whom vote, all of whom participate in the committee meeting, the discussion, and vote. And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how committees are formed, how that works, because some of them don't have actual established committees. It really is just whoever shows up gets to vote.
Sure. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I just turned the notes over, and the next one is the next paragraph is the next section is the establishment of committees, and we're prepared to talk about that. And I think it'll be helpful when we do regarding what you just pointed out, Ms. LaRue. So let me say this about quorums. It occurred to me while we were discussing these things. what organizations tend to do sometimes is they want to put their foot down and they want to say, by golly, we're going to make sure that a lot of people show up. So we're going to set a high quorum. We're going to say that you need, and I've watched organizations do this, you need at least 75% of the people to show up for us to do business. And they think they're doing a good thing. They think they're being strict and whipping everybody into shape, but it has the opposite effect, because what happens is, and if you want to set a quorum for less than a majority, you have that authority to do that, as long as it doesn't violate any laws. But you know, it being an NPU, but the thing of it is, the psychology of a quorum, for example, is if you set a lower quorum, let's say you need at least 25%. Sometimes people will gasp and say, only 25%? You got to be kidding me. Boy, we should need more than that. Well, yeah, you should. But what tends to happen is that if you have a lower quorum, then staying home and saying, well, I ain't going to show up, they won't be able to do any business without me. No, we still can. We can still do business. If you're bothered at anything, you know, let's talk it through, let's work it through. But if you're going to try to hinder things by staying home, actually you don't, because we have a small quorum requirement and we can still do business. And we just may end up doing business in a way that you don't approve of, but you could have contributed by being here. And so a smaller quorum it's a psychological thing. Typically a smaller quorum is more effective than a high standard for quorum. And just to repeat it again, the smaller quorum means that the group of people can't lock down the business. It can't prevent the committee or the organization from doing business. They can still do business. And so they'll be more apt to show up to be a part of that discussion. Any other questions before we proceed to the establishment of committees?
Ms. Hawkins, if you would like to unmute yourself, because I'm trying.
Very good. This, Mr. Conway, Ms. Terry, for example, if you have a quorum, you've got 10 people there, and there's a decision to be made, yet only 3 people vote, 2 for, 1 against, and the remainder simply don't. They don't do no, they don't vote, abstention. Is there any issue there in terms of validity of the outcome?
Actually, there's not in most common cases. What the common arrangement is for voting is those present and voting, a majority of those present and voting. And that's a very important phrasing, because what we're saying when we say a majority of those present and voting is that you can abstain if you want to. Nobody in a typical setting, nobody's required to vote. It's okay to say, I don't want to vote on this one. We should have the privilege even to abstain from voting, unless the organization establishes different rules. And there are organizations that do that and can, and there's a description for that. But let's say you have 10 members in this committee, and let's say 2 people say yes, and there's no special rules. It is in the committee, those present and voting, a majority of those present and voting. So you have 10 members that are there. You have 2 people that vote yes, 1 person that votes no. The motion passes. The motion passes because those who were voting were 3 people, and a majority of those 3 people voted yes. And what you ended up with was 7 abstentions. And that's okay. It's okay in a democratic society, in a democratic process. It's okay to abstain. There are setups, there are arrangements where, and I'll just say this in passing, we won't get into a lot of details because it can get kind of complicated, where you are required to have a majority of those present. There's a difference. Majority of those present voting as compared to a majority of those present. If it's a majority of those present, then an abstention at a certain threshold becomes a no.
Thank you.
Understand?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
We can keep going, Mr.
Okay. Okay.
Mr. Conway.
So what I've done is I've gone to page 2, the establishment of committees. And this is a quote from Robert's Rules of Order, 12th edition. The article, and I put in the bylaws, the article in the bylaws on committees should provide for the establishment of each of the standing committees. Don't ignore the 50. That's a footnote in the paragraph that I neglected to take out. The article in the bylaws on committees should provide for the establishment of each of the standing committees that it is known will be required. For example, the organization that has a bylaws committee, that has a program committee, it has a finance committee, etc. I'll continue. A separate section devoted to each of these committees should give its name, its composition, its manner of selection, and its duties. Now that's important. That's important. Miss LaRue pointed out that there are NPUs, or one, at least one, and it's none of my business. It's not mine to insist on any organization do anything or structure any certain way. That's not my place. My place is to provide what governance is and what governance works best for different organizations, et cetera. However, I will say that an organization that has a committee where it's just come one, come all, let's go ahead and have another, we'll have a committee meeting. Let's say the membership meeting is on a Monday night, and they say, okay, our zoning committee meets on Thursday night. And so when you go to the zoning committee meeting, most everybody that's there that was at the Monday night meeting, but it's called the zoning committee now. What you have in effect is you don't really have a committee. What you have is a special meeting of the membership to talk about zoning. That's what you have. And so and it's your business. It's the organization's business if they want to function this way. But just so you understand the ramifications of your structure, you are missing out on the opportunity, and perhaps intentionally, but you're missing out on the opportunity of setting a small group of people aside who are devoted to doing the specific detailed work that goes into making those kinds of recommendations, if you will. And so you could have just gone ahead without having the meeting on Thursday night, just talk about all that stuff on Monday night. And that way people don't have to come back, because there's really, for all intents and purposes, there's no difference, except that you had other business that you had to conduct on Monday night. But nonetheless, again, and I'm not trying to be unkind and I'm not trying to be negative, just understand the ramifications of that design. Okay. So what Robert's Rules of Order does is it talks about, first of all, it talks about how the name of the committee should be established, and typically in the bylaws. So we're talking about a zoning committee. So we know if we name a committee, the zoning committee, that body of members is going to be, and they are members of the NPU. That's what they would be, unless your NPU wants to bring in outside people and decide on that. We address that. So let's say you have a zoning committee that you've established in the bylaws. Well, that group of people are going to deal with issues regarding zoning. You know, they're not going to take up finance. They're not going to take up bylaws. They're going to take up zoning. That's going to be their specialty. And so that's important to indicate. We have a zoning committee. It sounds basic, but it is still pretty important. So not only that, the composition. How many are going to be in that zoning committee? Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 10? Is it going to be certain groups, certain individuals with certain areas of expertise? That's up to you as an organization. You'll decide how many people are going to be on that committee. You're going to decide whether or not you want to pick certain members of the committee or certain members of the NPU with certain qualifications to be on that committee. Maybe you want to spread it out geographically. We have an individual from this part of the NPU district. We have another individual from this part of the NPU district, et cetera, et cetera. That's something you may want to consider as an NPU. Again, that's up to you. But what will the composition be? The manner of selection. Will the chairperson select the members of the zoning committee? Or will the chairperson have the privilege of nominating who those members are going to be, where the NPU membership would then vote on those nominees? Or is it going to be that there's a nominating committee who does the work of trying to find the best people for the committee, and that the membership would vote on? It may be that you just start nominating from the floor. and then selecting those members that way. But keep in mind, if you have in your bylaws that there's not going to be any more than 5 people, or the committee is going to be staffed by 5 members, and this is the number I'm picking up, you don't have to use 5, but let's suppose your NPU says we're going to have a zoning committee, it's going to be 5 individuals. Unless you change your bylaws, you can't have 6, you can't have 7, and unless the bylaws stipulate, you can't have less than 5. So sometimes a committee will be no more than 5, for example. Then you could have 3, 4, or 5, etc. So that, again, there's a lot of things that go into establishing in the bylaws what a committee should look like and how you want your committee to function. But these are just some things to consider as you move forward. And then finally, the duties. Maybe there's certain aspects of zoning that you don't want your zoning committee to deal with. Maybe there's certain aspects of the zoning questions that you really want brought to membership, or maybe certain aspects need to go to another committee to take a look at and then come back to the zoning committee. I'm just giving examples, but you do need to give the responsibilities of a particular committee. Again, bylaws committee, program committee, finance committee, detail out their responsibilities. Generally speaking, if committees are not established in the bylaws, a vote of the assembly can establish a committee under certain circumstances. In other words, if your bylaws don't ever put a committee in place, and it seems like, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I looked over a few sets of bylaws before this class tonight, and the NPUs, and it seems like, and I could be wrong, seems like there was an NPU I saw that didn't have any committees established. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I remember seeing an NPU where the chairperson establishes committees. If I remember right, I saw that. And so be careful if you're looking in your bylaws and you don't see any, well, we don't have a finance committee, we don't have a zoning committee. Look carefully at the rest of the bylaws, because in this one example, it might get past you that you do have committees. It's just that the chairperson has the responsibility of setting those up. And so if the bylaws read that if it reads generally, and if it reads with no other qualifications, if the bylaws say that the chairperson will set up any committees that are to function in this given year or biennium, then you cannot change, you cannot establish another permanent committee without changing your bylaws. So that's important to note. Always know what your bylaws say, and there are certain rules of interpretation that come into play. That's in Robert's Rules of Order. There's certain rules of interpretation that come into play when looking at knowing how to apply your bylaws. So that's important. I do see one statement that came up on the chat. There is an NPU that doesn't have any committees, and so maybe some of the things we're talking about tonight. Maybe you're comfortable not having committees, that maybe you like the way things are going, you want to keep it that way. It's your organization, it's your NPU. Far be it from me to try to convince you one way or another. But maybe there's some value that you see, and maybe there's a sense in which the NPU that doesn't have committees, maybe they want to try that and take advantage of what that can bring. And you may end up saying, no, we don't like this, and go back and not do committees after that. But again, this is just information. This is just trying to teach you procedure and some of the advantages of one way and the other. Also, are there any questions for setting up committees or anything we've talked about so far?
So Eric Harrison had a question, but I wasn't sure to what part that he, Eric, if you want to come in real quick.
Sure. It was in relation to the zoning committee meeting on Thursday night and it being the whole population of the meeting on Monday night. Wouldn't that just be a committee of the whole instead of a special call meeting? And it,
In a sense,
splitting hairs, but
no, you're really not. As a matter of fact, I was going to bring that up and I neglected to. So thank you for bringing that up. It is in a sense like a committee of the whole, except that in committee of the whole, and you'll hear or watch the city council go into committee of the whole. fairly often, especially virtually. They'll do it just about every committee, just about every meeting. So what a committee of the whole is the organization as a whole going into the format of a committee. Under regular rules, you can only speak twice on a given motion. And when you're speaking, you get one speech and you don't get to speak again until everybody else has had a chance to speak, but you still get to speak twice. Unless somebody votes, unless the membership votes and puts an end to debate. And that's another, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here you have the organization, you have your membership going into committee of the whole. If it goes into committee of the whole, that means there's no limit on debate. That means that I can speak if I'm a member of the NPU and I'm not in leadership, and they can speak too, typically, unless you're the chairperson. So let's say I'm a member and I'm sitting in my chair and I speak, I stand up, I make a speech, we're in committee of the whole, and everybody else speaks, nobody else wants to, okay, I want to speak again. I get to again. I get to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times if I want to, as long as we're in committee of the whole and as long as everybody else gets a chance to speak after my speech. So that's committee of the whole. What it does is it's used uniquely, and it shouldn't be used all the time. There's certain reasons to use it, to use committee of the whole. You'll see Congress, if you watch Congress, the Senate or the House of Representatives, they'll go into committee of the whole on occasion. That's actually where it originated. And so, but with committee of the whole, now watch this, with committee of the whole, and the main distinction I wanted to point out, Eric, and thank you for bringing this up. In committee of the whole, I can make a motion to end committee of the whole, and it's called to rise. I make a motion that the committee rise. That means that if that passes and it's not debatable, it needs to be seconded and voted on, then committee of the whole is over. So that's one of the advantages of going into committee of the whole. You can end it anytime you want. When we're talking about our regular meeting on Monday night, come to the zoning committee on Thursday night, and on Thursday night we're going to talk about zoning stuff, and it's just all the members just come back on Thursday night. There's no ending that like that. There's no motion to rise and to put an end to committee work, to go back into normal rules and then finish the discussion and make a final decision there. What you end up doing on Thursday night is just, now you don't have very many. Matter of fact, you're in committee, and so you don't have the regular rules that you're dealing with. But I mean, you don't have the structure of rising, putting an end to committee of the whole, and going into normal rules because it's a committee meeting. And so the only thing you can do is just put an end to the meeting by a vote, and then you may or may not have finished. So I'm glad you brought that up. Eric, you're right, it's close, but there are certain advantages and certain distinctions in committee of the whole that are lacking in that Thursday night meeting that I think might prove important.
That was the last question.
Okay. All right. So the work of a committee, and I'll just, this is my statement. As was stated above, a committee is to conduct research on a subject and report its findings and perhaps make recommendations to the assembly. The research of the committee then can be broken down into 2 basic formats. And this is an important consideration when you're talking about committee work, and you'll see why. So the first line I have under that heading is the committee should have access to and consider all the information that exists in pertinent documents. And we talked about the zoning committees with the respective NPUs and the work that they do. Photographs they take, they have those photographs that could be considered documents. They're looking at the application, they're looking at the zoning laws, they're looking at other pertinent documents that are going to come into play with their decision to what they will recommend to membership. So it's important that the committee has all the documents that pertain to that work. And typically it's the secretary of the organization, the secretary of the membership, that is responsible for making sure that the committee chair has access that are going to be vital for their decision making. Sometimes the committee itself will generate documents, and that's okay. But again, this is still part of their research. So that's almost a given. I mean, that doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. But I wanted to bring it up just primarily to let you know that if you find yourself without documents, put a pause on if you can and get the documents before you make your recommendations. The second part of the work of a committee oftentimes has to do with listening to individuals. And so that's the next line. The committee may choose to hold public hearings to glean information from individuals who are involved directly or indirectly in a particular matter. So a committee will oftentimes do what's called a public hearing. What a public hearing is for is that, so the committee has documents, the committee is looking at all the various documents, and then the committee will say, well, you know, let's talk to the people that live across the street. And let's say we're talking about a zoning committee. Let's talk to the people that own the factory around the corner. Let's talk to the people on the nightclub down the street and to the left, who knows what, but they want to talk to some of the community members. Maybe they want to talk to the finance committee members for a given reason. What they'll do is, as a committee, they'll announce that they're going to have a public hearing. And that has to be a vote by the committee. You know, does everybody here want to have a public hearing? All in favor say aye. Aye. It passes. Okay, we're going to have a public hearing. In that public hearing, what the committee will do is listen to people, and the committee should put time limits down. They should say one person at a time. And it's best practice not to debate in that public hearing. In other words, when somebody is speaking from the community and the committee members are listening, that's really what it's for. You're listening. You might ask another question. What do you mean by that? Or are you sure that's, you know, could you say that one more time? Or are you sure you're referring to the right thing? Or are you talking about the gas station down the street or the one that's around the corner? Okay, the one down the street. Okay, continue. So you're asking questions and you're letting the community talk to you. You're taking notes. You're not entering into debate right now. You're just listening and taking notes and getting information. And then once that happens, once you're done with the public hearing, now you go back into your your committee meeting, and you discuss things as a committee, and you vote and so on. Now, here's why this is important. The aspect of the public hearing answers some questions that we've had come up already. One, notice that I pointed out that in a public hearing, the committee isn't debating anything. The committee is listening to the community and taking notes. Okay, so the community gets to speak. That's a specific time in the committee meeting that the public gets to speak. All right, then that comes to an end. Now that's important. Your public hearing is over. That means that now, and Ms. LaRue and I talked about this question because I wasn't sure if the NPUs fall under the public meeting laws or not, the sunshine laws. And in our judgment, they do. And so you'll have a meeting, you'll have a committee meeting, and the public will be there whether you like it or not. They're going to be there. So while that is taking place, you're meeting, you're discussing as a committee, you're making comments to each other, and you're making motions, you're voting, and so on. And hear this, and I'm not trying to be overly strict. I'm not trying to be restrictive or exclusive. But a committee meeting is a meeting of that committee. It's a meeting of those members of that body. It's not a public meeting. The public is there to observe. If you go to a committee meeting for the Atlanta City Council, I'll use this just as an example. If you go to a committee meeting of the Atlanta City Council, they're all facing you if you're downtown. They're in their respective chairs, and they're looking right at you, and they're speaking to each other. And you're in the audience on the other side of that little wall, and you're sitting in chairs and you're listening to them speak. You can't just stand up and say, "Excuse me, I have something I want to say." They give time for particular time slot for public comments, and you're limited to 2 or 3 minutes depending on the place of the comments. And so they allow you to do that. It's not a public hearing, but they're just allowing that. That's just what they do. So, and it has to do with state law. But still, the point being, if it's not that time frame where you get to speak to the mic and speak to the committee, you're sitting in the audience. You can't say, "Mr. Chair, I have something I want to say." That's out of order because you're not a committee member. You have no business speaking in that committee. And so The same thing would apply in an MPU meeting that is established, for example, a zoning committee of, and I'll just use this number just for the sake of reference, a 5-member zoning committee sitting in a room, and next to them, there's a whole bunch of people sitting in sort of an audience, and they're watching these 5 people sit at a table do business. That's kind of awkward. It'll take some getting used to, but that's really the pattern you're talking about. That's really the arrangement, because a committee meeting is a committee meeting. It's not a community meeting. So the members of the community, I mean, everything in them is going to want to stand up and say, excuse me, I just heard you say, and kind of interrupt the committee. They're not allowed to do that. They're just not allowed to do that. Now, let me back up and say, remember the example that we've established, and I think it happens in reality, where the committee is simply another meeting of the MPU, and there's no really isolated, established, populated committee of a select number of members of the MPU. It's just they were meeting on Monday night, the zoning committee meets on Thursday night, everybody shows up. That's in that setting where there's no limits established of members of the committee, et cetera, then anybody and everybody can talk. That's that situation. But ideally, well, let me back up and let me give you an example of a private organization. In a private organization, if we have, if the organization has a bylaws committee, it has a program committee, it has a finance committee, you can't just walk into a committee meeting, sit down and say, I want to be here. Not unless you're invited. It is by nature, it is executive session. By nature, a committee meeting is. And so what the sunshine laws have done is it said, no, but when you're in a public agency, and we've established, we believe that the NPU qualifies as that, when you're in a public agency, the public can show up. So that's what has happened. You've got a committee who is meeting, trying to conduct business, do their research, look at their documents, look at their pictures, look at the application, discuss it, make motions and vote. You've got that body of members set aside to do that. And you've got the community sitting behind them, just chomping at the bit to jump in and say, hey, stop it. And I don't want that. I told you, we can't, or maybe they're going to clap and say, yeah, you guys are wonderful, man. We're excited about that. You guys are just great. In either case, it's out of order. Not unless the committee invites the community to speak. And that's an important distinction. That's an important distinction.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Speaking of important distinctions, you said earlier that the committee meetings are not public meetings. And I just want to clarify for the benefit of all the MPU leaders who are here. Per the Code of Ordinances, all MPU meetings and their committee meetings are public meetings and must be open to the public. However, and I saw someone make a kind of questioning face when Dennis said that. But here's the distinction. What Dennis is talking about, and I think he made it very clear, is that that does not mean that everyone gets to speak at the committee meeting. The committee meeting is still intended to be for the members of the committee, for the members of the committee to speak. But it does have to be open to the public.
Yes, and if I said it in a way that wasn't clear, I apologize. But that is correct. With an NPU, even if you have a 5-member committee, the whole community gets to show up and watch that meeting. They just do because of the sunshine laws. And so, however, and Ms. LaRue, I believe we're on the same page here. And I can tell you're struggling. I don't want to bring you back in if you don't want to. But if your bylaws establish a committee, and let's say it's a committee of 5, whether it's finance, bylaws, whether it's a zoning committee, in that meeting, even if it's in a big room with a lot of people there, in that meeting, those 5 members are the only ones that are qualified to speak, qualified to make motions, qualified to vote. Only those. And unless the committee votes, not just the chairman says, you know, I'm going to let everybody else speak. The chairman doesn't have that authority. The chairman, and not unless the governing documents give the chairperson that authority. But if the committee wants to hear the membership, the members of the community speak, there's a vote that takes place by that committee and says, okay, we're going to listen to the community. So I know I sort of repeated it again, but Ms. LaRue, thank you for making that clear, because that can be kind of confusing. All right, so I'm going to read this last paragraph, and then our next section is going to be talking about debate, membership debate in a membership meeting. And so I'll read this, and then we'll answer any further questions about committees that you may have. By nature, a committee is a meeting of the members of that committee. Therefore, unless the committee as a committee decides otherwise, and this is basically what I just said, isn't it? But I still want to read it. Therefore, unless the committee as a committee decides otherwise, only members of that committee have a right to speak on a given subject at hand. Parentheses, note, while a committee may vote to allow non-members to speak, and this is important, watch this. While a committee may vote to allow non-members to speak, it does not have the authority to allow non-members to make motions or to vote on a matter. So if your bylaws have isolated a group of individuals, again, we're talking about a zoning committee a lot. If your bylaws have established 5 individuals to be members of the zoning committee is sitting at a table in the front of the room. Other people in the community are sitting in chairs next to them. And these 5 members are doing their business, and then they vote to allow members of the community to speak. That's legitimate. But it cannot vote to allow members of the community to be able to vote on a committee issue. It cannot vote to allow members of the community to make motions on a committee issue. It can only allow speech and input, verbal input. That's all it can do. So that's an important distinction. So before we go to the next part of the discussion, which is managing debate in the assembly, are there any other questions or observations about committee work in an MPU?
Nope.
No? How's that for thorough, huh? All right. So the next thing we want to talk about is the nature of debate. I catch some of the comments. I like the comments. So nature of debate. The democratic process depends on the ability of every member of the society being able to express his or her opinion. Now, we just got through talking about committees. Now we're gonna talk about membership, the membership meeting. Okay, so every person's opinion matters. No person is so intelligent that he or she has it all figured out. That's where the democratic process, that's a fundamental principle behind the democratic process. If somebody thought that they had all the answers, then just everybody look to that person and say, what should we do? Now there's certain settings where that is, where that happens, but that's not in a membership meeting of an NPU. That's not in a membership meeting of a nonprofit. That's not in a council meeting of the Atlanta City Council, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're in a membership meeting and somebody stands up, and pardon me, you'll know what I'm talking about. Somebody stands up and they make a recommendation, and you're slapping your forehead and you're thinking, what were they thinking? That just doesn't make any sense at all. Why would we want to do that? It's my recommendation. It's anyone that promotes and is for the democratic process. It's my recommendation and others that you should hear them out. Even if you don't think they're the sharpest knife in the drawer, even if you don't think that they have a lot to offer, you would be surprised where a lot of good ideas come from. Just because they cause you to roll your eyes every time they stand up, watch yourself. Let them speak. Let them have the allotted time that is provided to speak, and listen closely. Even if you're not impressed with them, listen closely. You would be amazed sometimes at what you'll learn. When every person is allowed to express their opinion and ideas, the assembly is, and this is important, boy, this is important. So I'm going to start again with this. Listen, zero in on this. When every person is allowed to express their opinions and ideas, the assembly is able to make the best possible decision, having received the greatest amount of information possible, even from the guy that you roll your eyes when he stands up to talk. So, or the lady or whoever. So if you'll just reach deep down inside and grab all that patience that you know you have, and listen and hear them out and let them have their allotted time, you may be just incredibly impressed with what the organization is going to do next, because something they may even trigger something in your mind. Maybe they don't say it, but they trigger an idea in your mind because they've been speaking, and you can move on from there. So it is just so important to let everybody speak and have the right to have their right to express their opinion. I'm going to tell you a little story. I usually don't do that in these things, but I'll just go. It's going to be a quick little story. And I heard it when I was a young man. I'm not a young man now, so it's an old story. So maybe you've heard it, but pardon me if you have. There was a company who moves buildings. For that was their service. And they got this particular building for an organization, and they were moving it to another lot. And I used to see that happen in Los Angeles. I lived in LA for a while. I used to see it happen in Portland. I haven't seen it happen around here too much, but when I was a kid, I would see it happen. So here's this organization. There's this company, and they're moving this building down through the highway, and they've got the yellow lights, and they've got the escorts and stuff. It's moving slow. And they got to an overpass, and they were watching the overpass, and they're watching the people walking on the road because it's moving slow. It's a big building, and they're watching it, and it starts scraping the overpass, just barely, but it starts scraping, and so they stop, and they think, oh goodness, we thought we had it. We measured it. We thought we had it. We knew we had it. I don't know what went wrong. So they stop. They call engineers in. They've got a bunch of guys with clipboards and suits, and they're looking around. They're walking around in this thing, and they're trying to figure out what to do next. Now, I know you've probably heard the story, but it's still a good story. I've never forgotten it. So a little kid rides up on his little Stingray bicycle, and he's looking at the whole thing. And one of the guys says, "Would you get away, please? We're trying to figure this out. We're trying to we got work to do. So please, son, if you don't mind." And before the little kid rode away, he looked up at the guy and he said, "Why don't you let some air out of the tires?" And these guys with the suits and the clipboards looked at each other, and they just giggled. He had it. He had the idea, and they did. And this is supposed to be a true story. It was told me as a true story. And so they let the air. They lowered the building by letting some air out of the tires, and they went through under the underpass. They had to go slow, but it solved it. So that little kid on his bicycle, that everybody's rolling their eyes. What's he going to say? Now chances are not everything that comes out of everybody's mouth is gold. I mean, that's just the way it is. So, but the point is you have a right to speak, and you're impressed with your ideas, and you're sure we all are. And so as you take your time to speak, as you take your time to share your opinions and ideas, we're glad you do. And I'm talking generally. I'm not a member of the NPU. So when we give you the time to speak as a member of the organization, every single person in that organization should have the same time, no matter how everybody feels about them or not. So that's important. Good ideas come that way. So next point. Does anybody have any questions?
Mr. Hess, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I also want to make the point that by making sure that everybody has input into it, you lend legitimacy to the eventual decision. Because when people feel like they've been cut out of the debate, then they will feel like, that they weren't given a chance, that they were cheated out of contributing to the decision. So it really behooves you to let everybody speak, even if you just let them speak once and keep it to 2 minutes or whatever, but you've got to let everybody who has a point make that point, because otherwise they'll feel like, in the future that they won't be allowed, that they won't be given a fair hearing, and they'll check out of the process. And these types of decision-making processes are only as good as how people believe in them. So that's, even if somebody is saying something that you think is dumb or not even entirely to the point, it's important to make sure that everybody is heard, just so that folks know that everybody has been heard.
Mr. Hess, that was an excellent point. And I like it. I'm going to write it down for later. I didn't think about that, but that is a part of the process, and that you're exactly right. It brings legitimacy to the vote. It brings legitimacy to the decision. Everybody had a chance to input. And so if I get a chance to speak, even if you don't vote my way, at least I got a chance to speak. And it's easier for me to support you, even if I lose the vote. Thank you, Mr. Hess. Thank you. That was very, very well put and very important. Someone else?
Ms. Hawkins, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Just kind of the counter to what Mr. Hess just said. Isn't it always a balance between the person who just wants to be seen, who just wants to, I shouldn't say be seen, that how do you control that? How do you keep the peace, but at the same time, generally the entire body recognizes that, that it's something other than the question that's before the group. What do you do?
We are actually going to talk about that in the next session forward, but I think Mr. Hess wanted to speak to that, and I'm okay with that if everyone else is.
So what I will do when I reach a point of contention is I'll say, this looks like, now I'm afraid that I'm not as good at Robert's rules as Mr. Conway is, but then I'm not being paid for it. I'll say, this looks like something that's going to get a lot of debate. So what I'm going to do is make sure, and we only have a limited amount of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a list of names, and I'm going to let everybody, I'm going to roll through that list of names and call on each person one time. There's not going to be any back and forth. And then I'm going to make another call for, names, so that we will get everybody who wants to speak, will get an opportunity to speak. You won't get an opportunity to monopolize the conversation. And then if we start getting to a point where it feels like it's just going back and forth and we're not making any progress, I'll ask for a motion to continue debate. That helps make the point, that actually pushes the decision back to the body. It makes the point that you're not just wasting my time, you're wasting everybody's time with this. So you can, if you set a time limit on the debate, then if somebody's making some sort of excellent point, you can say, hey, do we want to extend debate? And if folks say yes, then they can continue on with that if they feel that this is important. But I think that it helps to shut people down because many of us have had some talkative and passionate people showing up at our meetings. You've got to help demonstrate to those folks that they don't necessarily have the support of the body as well. So that's how I do it, is that I basically get everybody behind me to say, not I think, this is going on too long, but we think this is going on too long, and this is the business of the body, and now you're wasting our time.
Isn't there a motion to limit debate as well?
There is, and we'll get to that. Ms. Hawkins, and so I'm glad you brought that up. And Mr. Hess, let me commend you on your creativity for how to handle those things. As you pointed out, you're not a parliamentarian. You're not schooled in the laws and rules of parliamentary procedure. So I'll say this: your approach is practical, it's creative, and granting that everybody approves or generally approves. Where I would place that technically is under unanimous consent. There's no objections, so your approach is acceptable by the body. I will say this though, just so you're informed, any change in the procedures of debate have to be approved by the body. So, but I mean, they are approving what you're doing because they're not objecting, and it is a good practical move. But we'll talk a little bit about how to address long-winded folks, if you will, as we proceed. And as a matter of fact, that's the next section. Ms. Terry, if there are no other questions about that, I'll go to the next
There
section.
is one question from Mr. Martin. He wanted to know, how do you keep debate over policy separate from debate over process?
That's a good question. So one of the reasons I was brought in to the Atlanta City Council is because debate often declined into process. And if you are debating process, you are off topic. You shouldn't have to be debating process. There are certain circumstances where the body will make a decision on a vague point regarding process, but they're guided that way efficiently and properly. You as an NPU, you've got a chairperson who is supposed to know the basics of process. And I'm not trying to put a slant or a negative slant on anybody, but let me stress at this juncture, you are the chairperson. I would highly recommend that you get Robert's Rules of Order in brief. It's a basic treatment, and it's an abridged treatment made by the same authors of Robert's Rules of Order, if I remember right, essentially the same. And it is the basics, and it's easy reading. And so I would highly recommend that a chairperson gets Robert's Rules of Order in brief and knows the basics of process. That way, the membership meeting doesn't have to decline into a debate about process. So with that in mind, then the chairperson is ordering the meeting, directing the meeting according to process, because he's learned or she's learned the basics. Then you have a parliamentarian. As I understand it, most of the NPUs do have the office of parliamentarian. And with that parliamentarian, he or she should also know process. And what the parliamentarian's job is even though, let's suppose the chairperson and the parliamentarian, they both know the basics of process. Let's suppose that's the case. Well, why have a parliamentarian? Because the chairperson, what their job is to watch the nuances, watch the personalities, watch all the committees and the procedure and the agenda and so on. And there's a certain art to it. Even though you know process, there's a certain art to running a meeting. The parliamentarian is just function on process. He's focused on process. I mean, when I'm in a council meeting, I spend very little time trying to understand the content. I do at times for reasons that are obvious, but I am primarily focused on process. And when I'm whispering in the president's ear, is because she's looking at so much. And I, as a parliamentarian, will make recommendations to her, because that's all I've been doing is watching process. And I'll just say this and then I'll move on, if I'm answering your question. I'm a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians. I am actually, I'm certified by them. When the National Association of Parliamentarians, these are all parliamentarians, these are guys and gals that know their stuff. When one of them is serving as a chairperson in their membership meeting, there will be another parliamentarian who's serving as parliamentarian, sometimes two, for that chairperson who's also a parliamentarian. The reason for that is because the chairperson has a much broader spectrum that they have to focus on. The parliamentarian is just there to focus on process. So all that to say that the way you avoid debating process as a membership And I don't mean this in a negative way, I really don't. It perhaps I would encourage that the chairperson and the parliamentarian, they understand at least the basics of the process. That would stave off a lot of that time spent on debating process. Did that answer the question? I'm assuming it did. I don't hear anything.
Mr. Martin says so.
So? What else?
That's it from the chat.
Okay. All right. So we'll talk a little bit more about the downfall, the downside of someone talking too long. This is the second section under managing debate in the assembly. While every person should be free to share their ideas and opinions, a lack of control in the debate process will actually hinder access to pertinent information. For example, if a person is allowed to speak too long, certain negative things may occur as a result. So if I've got a lot to say and I really want to get my point across, and they're just not listening to me, and I've said this, and they're not paying attention. So my solution is to just take as much time as I possibly can. I know what the time limits are, but sit me down, go ahead and try, because I've got a lot to say and you folks need to listen. And so I'm gonna try to get my point out there. I'm gonna try to make sure everybody hears me for sure. So I'm gonna take as much time as I want. Well, what begins to happen is that the organization suffers just due to the fact that I'm just one voice. I'm just one brain. And I've only got a limited amount of ideas, no matter how smart I think I am, no matter how smart other people may think I am. If I overspeak and take way too much time, other people who have ideas and input are going to get fatigued. They're going to get wore out, and they're going to think, well, I was going to say something, but I'm not going to now. We're just here too late. And I don't want to talk now because I just want to get home. I got to get the kids to bed. They got school tomorrow. And this individual who spoke too long, even though he may think his point is so important, he's going to do that, or she's going to do that. Now you're losing information. Now the organization is losing pertinent information that would have had otherwise. Or other people may become frustrated and take a negative attitude toward that person's ideas. So you think you're going to speak a long time and really make your point, but then if you're paying attention and you look around, and if they're not careful, you're going to see them rolling their eyes, and you're going to see them, shaking their heads, because what has happened is they know that you're not being fair to everybody else. They know that you are overtaking your time, and you're impressed with your points, and you're sure everybody else will be when you drive it home. But that's not the result. The result is that you've been, pardon me, but this is what I've seen this. I've had people tell me after meetings they were rude, and now I'm not for their ideas. I'm frustrated at what they did. They were rude to us by dragging it on so long. And now, even though I might have been, fond of what they were saying, I'm not now. I'm tired of hearing about it. And that takes me to the next point. The person who is speaking too long usually begins to repeat himself or herself, and others may then take on a negative attitude toward those ideas. You can only talk on so long before you start talking in circles. It just happens. We're all human, and you feel like you're really stressing the point, but all you're doing is just repeating yourself over and over again. And what happens is people, you're human, I'm human. We all end up there. We have fatigue sets in, emotions set in, and we go, well, when he first started talking, I thought that was a good idea. I'm tired of hearing about it now. He won't be quiet. He won't sit down. So no, even if it is a good idea, I ain't voting for it. He's done ticked me off. Now that happens. I'm just here to tell you that does happen. So when you have somebody over speaking their time limit, whatever that time limit is, it is harmful for the organization. And first of all, and secondly, the person who thinks they're getting a lot done and really going to be heard, they actually have the opposite effect. They actually end up turning people against their ideas and, in a sense, against what they've done, and they don't have the support they may have thought they had. So that's the downside. That's the downside of speaking too long. Does anybody have any comments or questions about that? We're going to talk about controlling debate in the next section, but does anybody have any questions? Okay. There are specific mechanisms that parliamentary law and procedure prescribe that are geared toward bringing order to group discussions. The book Robert's Rules of Order, and as I've talked about Robert's Rules of Order in brief, this whole system is geared toward this. This whole system is set up to make group meetings organized, efficient, and without taking too much time. That's how it's set up. That's what it's for. So I'll read the paragraph. It's important to understand that parliamentary procedure is designed just for this specific purpose, to bring organization and structure to group discussions, so that proposals can be presented, discussed, and decided upon in an organized and efficient way, regardless of the size of the group. As I pointed out, one group that I served as a parliamentarian for, they had a 1,400 membership that all had the privilege of speaking if they chose to. And we handled it, we did it. We processed the information in the debate properly, and everybody was satisfied with the process, because Robert's Rules of Order has rules and regulations in place to handle that kind of a group. I am the parliamentarian for an organization that has a board of directors, roughly 350 people. That's the size of their board of directors. And they speak and debate. They have meetings for a couple, 3 hours. And I'm the parliamentarian and I guide them through the process, and they get a lot done. They say a lot, and they're done in 2 or 3 hours, and they've done business. They meet twice a year. So that's because we're using parliamentary law and procedure. So controlling debate, that's the question. We want to control debate. So what we want to do then is we want to use parliamentary law and procedure to do that. That's what it's for. Otherwise, everybody just interrupts each other and talks too long and gets mad at each other. And, you shut up, it's my turn to talk. And you've been talking long enough. And no, I still got something to say. You got to talk last week, and on and on we go. So the structure is what it is. Let me use this example. I didn't write this down, but I bring this up a lot in other lectures. And so I think it's fitting here. I don't live in Atlanta. I live in Cedartown. And that's actually beneficial for me not being a member of the city of Atlanta, because I don't have a dog in the fight. In other words, when city council is trying to make decisions, I don't live in the city. And so it doesn't affect me, and it doesn't cloud my thinking, if you will. So, but let's suppose that you woke up in the morning and the city of Atlanta made an announcement. And the announcement was this: we are going to go ahead and put an end to the traffic rules this morning. Don't worry, all the traffic lights are shut off. We're not going to have any turning lanes. There's no one-way streets anymore. And you just go ahead and drive your way to work or wherever it is you're going. All that we ask is that you be nice. Now, I use this illustration a lot because it makes the point, in my view, and in other people that have spoken to me. It really is a good analogy. No matter how nice everyone would be, I got to get somewhere. He's got to get somewhere. She's got to get somewhere. And a lot of times we're in a hurry, or a lot of times we misunderstand who should go next and whose turn it is, and so on. And so without any of those traffic lights, turning lanes, one-way streets, stop signs, etc., even the nicest among us, we're going to bump into each other. This is going to happen. So that's what parliamentary law and procedure is. It's the traffic laws of discussion. That's all it is. And so if we all obey the traffic laws of discussion, and it's termed debate, and there's nothing, I don't have anything against you. I just want to share my opinion. We have different opinions. It's nothing against each other. We're just debating, and that's okay. But as long as if we obey the traffic laws of debate, then everybody gets to go where they're going, get there, and everybody gets to hear, and everybody gets organized, and the chances of there being hurt feelings are greatly reduced. Greatly reduced. I watch it over and over again as I go into organizations who are struggling. So that's what we're talking about. Controlling debate. We are obeying the traffic laws of debate. Robert's Rules of Order and Procedure. Okay. Therefore, let me just put in another plug. Therefore, it would behoove leadership to learn the basics, at least the basics of procedure. So the next paragraph under that, the default limit for debate, are you sitting down? The default limits for debate are the following. Each member has the right to speak twice on each debatable motion for 10 minutes per speech. That's accurate. That is Robert's Rules of Order. If there are no special rules put into place, each member has a right to speak 10 minutes per speech on a debatable motion. And in most debatable motions, most all debatable motions, you get to speak twice on a motion. So each person in the room on a debatable motion, if everyone wanted to take their full limit, every person in the room gets to speak for 20 minutes. That's the default rules. All right. So I can't see your faces, but a lot of times when I share that in a room, I see a lot of people gasp and a lot of eyes roll. And so, because that's a long time, isn't it? So I'm sure there are certain people that you don't want to share that with, am I right? So I'm going to read the next sentence. Once the member has spoken the first time on a motion, he or she is not allowed to speak again until every other person has had a right to speak. Then he can take up his next 10 minutes. That's how the rules go. And I put this in parentheses here because people are fanning themselves by now, and I just want to make sure that there's some help here. Most organizations of any size modify these rules in order to make debate more efficient. Okay. And we'll talk about that. So let's suppose whatever the lines are, whatever the rules are, let's say that the NPU or the organization has reduced that 10-minute number down to something, say 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, who knows? Excuse me. Let's say it is 10 minutes. Somebody stands up to speak, and they're going and they're going and they're going and they're going. I mean, they're the ever-ready bunny, and they just got so much to say. When somebody reaches their limit, whether it's 3, 5, 10, when they reach their limit, it's not improper for a member to stand in the meeting, say, point of order, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairperson. Yes, what is your point? Our beloved member here has a lot of nice things to say, but they've reached their limit, and they seem to be going over their limit. So I would ask that our membership obey the limits that are in place, the speech time limits that are in place, and Mr. Chair, I hand it back over to you. And so it's the chairman's job from there, it's the chairperson's job from there to enforce the rules. And so the chairperson would either say, and I can't remember who it was, perhaps it was Mr. Hess, brought it up that if somebody is speaking and everybody's just enthralled, and that rarely happens, but everybody's just enthralled and they want to hear more, then the chairperson might say, if there's no objections, we'll let member so-and-so continue for another couple minutes. And if there's no objections, you let him do that. But in most cases, what the chairperson would do is the chairperson would say, Mr. Jones' point is well taken, Mr. Smith. And so, Mr. Smith, if you would please take a seat. You got to your time limit. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, but we need to move on. And so that's the chairperson's responsibility. And don't be afraid to use it. Be kind, be respectful, always be kind and be respectful. And let me say that along these lines. In Robert's Rules of Order, to be disrespectful, to implicate people, to doubt their motives, to get personal, to get negative is actually out of order. You can be asked to sit down if you start getting disrespectful, and the chair has every right to do that. So in other words, you can't turn around and say, and you lied the other night. You can't do that. As soon as somebody does that, it's the chairperson's responsibility to say, you need to take that back, or I need to have you sit down. You cannot be calling people out like that. You can't be disrespectful like that. So respect and courtesy is actually part of the process, an important part of the process. You can be asked to sit down and stop talking if you don't obey that. I've done that before in meetings. I've done it like a couple times. I've had to ask somebody to sit down. One person stood up and said, I believe the board of directors is lying to us. And I said, this is not a trial. You can't do that. You can't say that. I'm going to ask you to retract that. He said, I won't. I said, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down. And he did. And we continued with the meeting. So there are certain limits to what you can and can't say. You can't be disrespectful. So that was important. In other words, Mr. So-and-so, you've reached your time limit. Could you please sit down? Well, we might get a little upset and start saying negative things. Well, that wouldn't be in order. So the last paragraph in on this page, if there is no special rule in place and in the Assembly's judgment, debate is taking too long on a particular motion, a member may make a motion to limit debate on that particular question. Such limits might include one speech per person, or 2-minute limit per speech, or a debate will end. And we turn the page over. A debate will end on this motion after 15 minutes, etc. An organization in the middle of debate on a particular motion, there is a motion in place. It's called to limit or extend limits of debate. Someone can stand up and say, this has been going on too long. I make a motion that from this point forward, all motions are limited to 1 minute, and each person only has a chance to speak once on this particular motion. That's legitimate. It has to be seconded. It can be amended. It's not debatable, and it takes a 2/3 vote. And if that passes, from that point forward, for that particular motion that's being debated, that's the new rules. That's the new debate rules. And so here's another, pardon me, I'm not trying to, well, maybe I am trying to hammer this home, but knowing procedure, if you weren't aware of that particular motion, that would be helpful if you did know about that particular motion, because on a particular item, if you don't have special rules in place for debate on a particular item that's just going on too long, well, let's fix it by voting to put an end to it, or let's fix it by changing the rules of debate on this particular motion. So that leads us to the next paragraph. If there are no special rules in place, in the Assembly's mind, in the Assembly's judgment, debate has gone on long enough, a motion can be made by a member to call the question. Now you hear that motion in organizations a lot. I call the question. Well, that's technically, that is known as move the previous question. That's parliamentary title of the motion. This motion requires a second. It is not debatable, is not amendable, and it requires a 2/3 vote. So the way this goes is this. So debate is going on, and let's say, and this is the way I see it happen often, and it shouldn't happen this way. Debate is going on, somebody's speaking, and then somebody hollers out, I call the question. You can't do that. This motion cannot interrupt somebody. There are a few motions where you can interrupt somebody. This isn't one of them. So you can't just interrupt somebody and say, I call the question. You have to wait and you have to wait to be recognized. In other words, let's suppose Mr. Smith has been talking, he sits down, and then somebody else stands up and is recognized by the chair. And then you say, I don't want to hear anybody else. And you say, I call the question. You can't do that either. You can't do that either. This motion is just that. It is a motion along with the previous one too. If you want to make a motion to limit debate, it functions the same way. You have to stand, and if it's your turn and the chair recognizes that, the chair will call on you. And then if the chair calls on you, then you make the motion. You can't just holler it out. It doesn't work that way. That's out of order. So you get the chair's approval to speak. You make the motion. It's seconded, and to call the question, it's not debatable. It's not amendable. It takes a 2/3 vote. Once that vote takes place, so now let me back up. Let's suppose the zoning committee has brought a recommendation, and the zoning committee says, we recommend that this be approved. All right. So then there's some people in the room that really like it. There's some people in the room that really don't like it. And so debate just is going on a long time. And then Mr. Smith sits down, I stand up, and I say, I move the previous question, or I call the question. After being recognized, I say, I move the previous question. And then somebody says second. All right, so then, like I said, it's not amendable, it's not debatable, it takes a 2/3 vote. Let's say we get the 2/3 vote. All right, now we have called the question, we have ordered the previous question. That means now it's time to vote on the proposal that the zoning committee brought before the body. That vote of 2/3 doesn't approve or deny that motion that was being debated. It just simply says, now it's time to vote because we just decided we're not going to talk anymore by a 2/3 affirmative. We've decided we're not going to talk anymore. We're going to go ahead and we're going to vote on the recommendation that the zoning committee brought before this body. And it may pass, it may fail, but everybody's done talking and it's time to vote. That's what that means. So that is a way to control. Those are ways that you can control debate. That's just how it, those are just ideas, and these are legitimate parts of procedure. Last paragraph under that heading. An organization of any size will often pass a special rule that permanently limits debate in the following ways. One speech per person. These are examples. I'm not recommending these. You have to decide if you want, as an organization, to permanently limit debate. You have to decide on what those limits would be. But here's some examples. One speech per person, per debatable motion. A limit of 2 minutes per speech. A motion may only be debated for 10 minutes, etc. Those are just some examples of limits that an organization will put on debate as a standing rule or as a special rule. And in order to establish that, there has to be a notice, a 2/3 vote, and then and only then will that special rule be established. It's a high standard. It's a high threshold. You have to give notice that you're going to be bringing that rule as a proposal. Then it has to be seconded, and then there's a 2/3 vote that's required to make that a permanent rule, whatever your restrictions would be if you decide to do that. Now, because that's going to be a main motion if you decide to do that, and I've already established, we're working on a way to get questions, and I don't know if I should bring this up, but you know, look under Robert's Rules of Order in brief or something like that. You know, if you don't have anybody available to ask the questions, look under Robert's Rules of Order in brief, and you'll see that for that kind of a thing, it is for that kind of a motion as a main motion that is debatable and amendable. So let me make a distinction here for you. Let's suppose one of the MPUs, a member of the MPU says, you know, I think that might be a good idea for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give notice at our next meeting that I'm going to bring this up, and I'm going to and write it out. By the way, you need to write it out what you think the restrictions ought to be. So you write that out and you say, I'm going to make this motion in our next meeting. And then at the next meeting, somebody seconds it. And then when that happens, because it's a main motion, it's called an incidental main motion. There's no other motions pending when it comes up. That is debatable, it's amendable, and it still requires a 2/3 vote. The first process that I described, a motion was pending. A debatable motion was pending. And so because of that, the motion to limit debate or expand limits of debate was a privilege motion, and it's not debatable. That gets kind of confusing, but there's logic behind it and there's reasoning behind it, and it's functioning and it's efficient. And so if you have more questions, we can certainly deal with that. But just to help you understand that your organization can put in permanent limits on debate. And when somebody reaches that limit, if they're not going to sit down, then stand up, and you can interrupt somebody to call a point of order. That is one of the motions that you can interrupt somebody on, is a point of order. So I've said a lot, and before we move on, does anybody have any questions about some of the things I said regarding controlling debate?
We do have a question from Mr. Martin. He wanted to know if someone moves to end debate after debate has ended, i.e., no one is waiting to speak, do you have to deal with that motion?
Yes. For example, debate is taking place, and if I understand you, Mr. Martin, correct me if I don't understand you. So the question is, people have been debating this recommendation from the zoning committee. I'll just put it that way. And in that in that debate, now there's a pause. The chair says, is there any further debate? And there's a pause. And so then you hear somebody stand up and they say, and you know, it's Mr. Smith. He stands up and the chair calls on him or it's Miss Smith calls on her, and the member says, I move the previous question, or I call the question. If that's seconded, it does have to be processed. Now that's important, and Mr. Martin, I think I know why you're saying it. If I'm chairing a meeting, and this is the way a chair would typically function, I'll just put it that way. If I'm chairing a meeting and there's a pause and doesn't look like anybody else is interested in saying anything else, the question to ask is, are you ready for the question? That means, are you ready to vote? And in colloquial terms, perhaps that would be a better way to say it. Are you ready to vote? And so, and if nobody says anything, then okay, the motion is on such and such, such and such. All in favor say aye, all opposed say no, if it's just going to be a voice vote. However, if I'm chairing a meeting and there's a pause, and before I get a chance to say, are you ready for the question? Somebody says, I moved the previous question. I have to honor that, because that is a legitimately moved motion that was moved in order. And if it's seconded, then we just vote on it. And you might think, well, debate was over anyway. Maybe. I mean, maybe I would have said, are you ready for the question? And there would another hand would have gone up at the back. So you never know for sure. Good chance in some cases, but there's always still that chance that somebody else, once I ask, are you ready for the question? There's still that chance that somebody else would have said, well, I actually do have something I want to say. So yes, go ahead and honor that motion, even though it looks like debate is over. Someone else. All right, we'll move on to the next. Yes.
I'm sorry, I did receive a question privately in private message.
Yes.
What if the chair excludes or mutes the parliamentarian? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I'll try to. So that's happened to me as parliamentarian. When I'm serving in the chair, when I'm serving the president or the chairperson as a parliamentarian, I don't have any authority. And that's important to recognize. The authority belongs to the chair, and the authority beyond that belongs to the majority voting members, the majority of the voting members in the room. So it goes like this: the majority of the voting members, the chairman, who's acting as a referee, as an umpire, as a director, and it's supposed to be objective. And so the parliamentarian is standing off to the side. What the parliamentarian is doing essentially is consulting. He is giving suggestions and recommendations based on his understanding or her understanding of parliamentary law and procedure. So if I speak to the president of Atlanta City Council, or if I speak to the chairman of Atlanta Regional Commission, or any other organization that I work with, I speak to them and say, actually, procedure would require you to do such and such. And they might say, I know, but I'm not going to do it this way, that way this time. I'm doing it this way. I would back up and let them have it. And that's happened because they have the authority. Now, I am there to provide consultation. I am there to provide the information of the rules and of parliamentary law that's going to make the most efficient and informed meeting possible. That's my expertise. That's my job. That's what I do. So let's suppose the chairperson does that. The chairperson says, well, I've heard the parliamentarian, but I'm not going that route. They have that authority, first of all. Second of all, they may know a little something about the meeting that I don't. They may know a nuance that's going on that I'm focused on process. They're focused on the big picture. So they may be right in doing that, even though it's skewed. It's skewed procedurally wise. They may be taking a risk and saying, I'm going to do this and hope it works out for the best because I see something that's going on and this is the only thing I can think of to fix it. They may be right, they may be wrong, but it's their mistake to make. I'll put it that way. I use that a lot. It's their mistake to make. Now let's suppose I give a recommendation and the chairperson says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. Somebody out in the room, in the membership, knows parliamentary rule and procedure. And they saw what the chairperson just did. Then the member stands up and says, excuse me, point of order. You can't entertain a motion to amend because the motion to send a committee is pending. The motion to amend is out of order. You can't do that, Madam Chair or Mr. Chairman. That's against the rules. And so he may say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. Or she may say, I'm going to do it anyway. Then what the motion is by that person who called the point of order, I appeal the decision of the chair. Second. And so now what that means is if a member appeals the decision of the chair or the ruling of the chair, then if the chairperson is outvoted, then the chairperson is overruled and their decision is overturned. As I said before, when I began to answer this question, the final authority in the room is the majority of the voting membership. It is not the chairperson. I provided a training seminar for the Atlanta City Council membership. And I was privileged to be able to do it. It was a good time, good people. I enjoyed myself. And I looked at all the rules to make sure that this was accurate, and it is, even at the Atlanta City Council, and they know it. When Madam President at the Atlanta City Council makes a ruling, she knows and they know she can be overruled by a majority vote of the council because they have the final authority in the room. Well, what if they're wrong? Here it comes again. It's their mistake to make. Okay, so it is the chairperson's job to make rulings. It is the parliamentarian's job to advise and only to advise. And if the chair is wrong and the body doesn't like the decision that the chair made, the body can overrule the chair and reverse the decision.
We have a follow-up question from Ms. Linda Adams. She wanted to know, quote, so what is the purpose of the parliamentarian, which is an elected officer, question mark.
The purpose of the parliamentarian is to provide advice. So I spoke to this earlier, and I'll do it again, and because it is confusing, and I'll go as quickly as I can. The chairperson knows parliamentary procedure. The chairperson is going to make rulings and so on, but the chairperson is having to have a broad scope of focus. They're having to watch so much more than procedure, and so all the parliamentarian is focused on is procedure. The parliamentarian is not focused on the full aspects of the meeting like the chairperson is. And so what the parliamentarian is doing is saying, this is what procedure is, this is what procedure is if there's a misstep or if they're going the wrong direction with procedure. And they're advising the chairperson accordingly. And as I pointed out, even in the National Association of Parliamentarians, where a parliamentarian is serving as the chairperson, that chairperson will have a parliamentarian who's also a professional parliamentarian serving him or her. I've done it. I've had parliamentarians serving me because I'm focused on so much more. And to have that advisor in my ear is such a help. Now, there's a little bit more to it, and I'll add it now. I'm a professional parliamentarian. I know Robert's Rules of Order very, very well. The unabridged version. I'm also a student of Mason's Manual. I'm also a student of AIP's Standard Code. So there's 3 books that I study. In most cases, and this isn't me patting myself on the back, this is my chosen profession. In most cases, I know more about procedure than the chairperson does. Okay, so in most cases, when I speak to the chairperson, I'm actually providing information that they needed because they didn't understand it. In most cases, that still doesn't negate the fact that when a parliamentarian, when a chairperson is trying to is trying to watch the whole meeting and understand all the nuances and know how to finesse it, if you will, that still doesn't negate the fact that it's helpful to have a parliamentarian who may only know as much as the chairperson right next to the chairperson, so that he can speak to the rules. The chairperson may say, thank you, I'm going another direction, or say, thank you, I'll adjust, but that's still so important. If you've ever been in a place of a chair and you've got that chairperson who knows how to do their job and knows what they're doing, I think you can relate and understand that it is helpful. Someone else. Is there another question?
No, there are not.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do with the rest of the time, or at least it may not take the rest of the time, but regardless, I'm going to speak to the idea of meeting virtually. All right, because it can get confusing, and you feel like, well, I'll just go ahead and just start reading what I've written for your notes. Controlling debate in a virtual environment. Presently, many meetings are taking place by way of the internet. This poses some unique challenges that need to be addressed. Below are some suggestions for conducting an orderly meeting while operating virtually. The line right after that, if there are special limits on debate, announce those rules at the beginning of the meeting. Even if you don't, I don't know, we'll leave it up to you, of course, as leaders of the meeting, but I don't, most people don't like to let people know they've got 20 minutes total for each debatable motion, split up twice between two speeches. So that's up to you. But it really comes into play if the organization has put limits on the meeting. One speech per debatable motion, 2 minutes per speech, 5 minutes per speech. However, you've done that. If you have done that, then let me recommend that you announce that at the very beginning, or put it up on a list of rules like what we did tonight, what Ms. Terry put up. Let everybody know up front that this is how we function in this Zoom meeting. This is how we function in this Teams meeting. These are the rules. That way, when you enforce the rules, they don't feel like you've singled them out. And if you're consistently enforcing the rules, that will help them not feel like they're being singled out. Because if you don't announce the rules, if you've got just one minute limit or a 2 minute limit on a speech, they don't get one speech, and they're talking away, and all of a sudden you mute them, the facilitator mutes them, then, well, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't fair. I didn't know that I only had 2 minutes. You just don't like me. We all want to be treated fairly, and if you don't announce it ahead of time, you might cause some people to feel like they're being singled out. So announce it ahead of time. When a member is approaching the time limit that has been established, perhaps a warning would prove helpful. For example, 30 seconds is left, or whatever convenient time would be. I've seen that to be helpful too. Give them a warning. Maybe they have 2 minutes to speak, and at the 30 seconds left, let them know somehow. Maybe with something that pops up, or the chair says 30 seconds left or something. Help them out. Help them to stay controlled. You, as an organization, you've put the limits in place. Go ahead and help them with it. They have opinions. They have strong opinions. And everybody should. That's good that you're passionate about your ideas. So help them to be organized. Help them to stay in line with the rules that have been established. Along those lines, let me say this as well. Let me point this out. Remind everyone that, because ultimately the chairperson is going to be enforcing the rules. That's the person whose job it is to enforce the rules. Remind everyone that it's not the chairperson's rules. It is not. Let's suppose Mr. Smith is chairing the meeting. Well, it's not John Smith's rules. It is important that everybody recognize that and help them to understand that. I tell organizations that all the time. I did a job, I did a meeting for an HOA one time, and they were all very, very angry, very upset. And when they found out I was there, a lot of them started cussing about it and really angry and tossing chairs. And I was real glad to be there. But that's just what it is. So nobody got hurt, nobody was abused. What I did when I opened the meeting is I said, because I was asked to chair the meeting, what I did is I said, I want you to understand, we're going to enforce the rules, but you need to know they're your rules. They're the rules that you put into place as an organization, not me. These aren't Dennis Conway's rules. And that's the case. Every time I help an organization, even the chairperson, it's not their rules. Your bylaws likely say that you install Robert's Rules of Order as the governing guidebook for procedure. And if you put special rules in place, well, the chairperson didn't do it. There was a 2/3 majority vote that did it. It was a super majority that established these limits. So remind everybody that this isn't Dennis's rules. This isn't John Smith's rules. It's not the chairman's rules. It's not even the parliamentarian's rules. These are your rules that you voted in. And so if you don't like the rules, change them. But until then, let's enforce them. Let's obey them. And that's helpful. When I did that with that HOA organization, it went a long ways, and they were intense and they were still bothered, but it was organized. It was organized, and we had a good meeting. Okay, so this is a long paragraph. It's the next paragraph down. When a member's time for their speech is expired, if they just keep on talking and ignoring the established limits, let them know as tactfully as possible, because everybody deserves respect. Let them know as tactfully as possible that they are going to be muted according to the rules in order to accommodate the next speaker. When it hits the 2-minute mark, just say, we're sorry, your 2 minutes are up. Just so you know, we're getting ready to mute you. We're getting ready to mute you. And thank you so much. And, try to be as tactful and helpful as can. And then they were warned ahead of time. They got the 30-second warning. And now they've done their 2 minutes, and we're really sorry, but thank you so much. We're going to let the next person speak now. Appreciate it. And then the facilitator hits the mute button, and that's my recommendation. Because otherwise, we go back to the scenario where the individual just talks ad infinitum, and you start seeing people drop off the meeting. And of course, who wouldn't, right? So, and we're going to speak a little bit more to that, okay? So, it is important to keep in mind that while you may avoid offending that one member by allowing them to speak beyond the limits. So here's the thing, here's what happens, and I'm going to finish this sentence in a moment. You don't want to offend that person by muting them. You want to let him keep going, because that's Mr. Smith. Everybody likes Mr. Smith, and he and I had lunch the other day, and I'm sharing this thing. I don't want to offend Mr. Smith, and so, but he's gone way past his limit, and he was warned at the beginning. He was 30-second warning, and so tell you what, I'm just going to let him go because we don't want to offend him. So that's typically the emotion that takes place with a chairperson, because they don't want to offend the speaker. So let me finish the sentence. By doing so, you certainly run the risk of offending the other members in the meeting. So if you've got a meeting of 50 people, and you don't want to offend that one person by muting them, or by asking them, if you're in person, by asking them, say, you're done, your 2 minutes are done, would you please sit down? If you're afraid of offending them, keep in mind that by not offending them, you're offending 49 others. And that's important to keep in mind. Remember, if everybody wants Mr. Smith to keep on talking, then the chairperson senses that and says, if there's no objections, we're going to let Mr. Smith continue for another minute, or for however long the body wants Mr. Smith to continue talking. But it's up to the body, the other 49 members, if you will, or at least a majority of them, because they're members too. They want to speak. They don't want to just listen. Chances are they don't want to just listen to Mr. Smith all night. They got something to say. So You've not offended Mr. Smith, but you've succeeded in offending the other 49. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. If a member is going to speak beyond the limits, and this is the last sentence, I already said it, permission is granted ultimately by the assembly. Okay, so any questions about that portion of the talk? Any other questions?
We have a question in the chat. Can a timer be used to be efficient at all?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, there are timers that are used in person. There are timers that are used in electronic meetings. I have to confess to you that I'm not a tech person. I wouldn't know how to implement that as well as some others. But when a timer is used, and a timer is used often, when a timer is used, understand that what takes place is you usually have somebody else that's keeping time. You usually have a facilitator or somebody that's set aside to let the chairperson know that their 2 minutes is up. But only the chairperson can determine that they need to be muted. Only the chairperson can determine that their time is up, because the chairperson has to retain that authority even in a virtual meeting, because he's the only one that has that authority to have someone. He has the authority under the membership, but he has the authority. It's his responsibility to determine when somebody's time is up and to tell them they must end the speech. So it's not, so the point is, even if you've got a timer, don't give them the button of the mute. Don't say, okay, you're the timer. When somebody's hit the 2 minutes, just hit the mute button. That would be a mistake in my view, because what I would recommend rather than that is that the timer is keeping time, and when you see that the time is up, let the chairperson know, and then the chairperson will take it from there.
Ms. Adams, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I'm just not clear on this parliamentarian piece, because the question I asked wasn't clear. And then Jim asked the question, seems as if it's a bad idea to have a parliamentarian who is also a voting member of the body. So does the parliamentarian votes, does the parliamentarian have anything to do with the meeting, or you can't advise the chairperson if they muted you? So I just need to know, what is the real purpose of a parliamentarian?
Okay, thank you. I didn't get that part of the question. I didn't hear the part of the question regarding can they vote, can they speak, etc., and how do they talk to the chair. So that's helpful. I'll do my best to answer as clearly as I can. The parliamentarian cannot speak in debate. As a matter of fact, I was helping an organization, and their parliamentarian, who was the official parliamentarian, I was a professional parliamentarian, but they were the official parliamentarian. They were speaking in debate. And so I let them know, no, the parliamentarian is not allowed to speak in debate, and they changed things. And now they don't have that set up that way. So the parliamentarian, if they're a member, even if they're a member of the organization, they can't speak in debate. If somebody is a member of the organization and they're nominated to serve as parliamentarian, they need to know going into that if they take that position, there may be a hot topic come up that they feel passionate about. Even in that setting, they must keep their opinions to themselves. They cannot speak about yay or nay about the issue at hand, not even to the chairperson. They can't lean over to the chair and say, well, I think that recommendation should be voted in. That is out of line for a parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is there exclusively to provide consultation to the chairperson or the body if called upon regarding procedure. That's their job. Now, as far as voting is concerned, a parliamentarian cannot vote in a voice vote. If they're a member of if they are a member of the organization and the chairperson says all in favor say aye, if the parliamentarian is for it, he can't say aye or she can't say aye. When they call for the negative vote, neither can they say nay. In a voice vote, the parliamentarian cannot vote. In a ballot vote, they can. In a ballot vote, if they're members of the organization, they can vote. The parliamentarian can vote. That's legitimate because nobody knows how the parliamentarian is voting. The parliamentarian needs to maintain a neutral position by all appearances. Everybody knows the parliamentarian has opinions. Everybody knows the parliamentarian, if he got the chance, or if it was okay, or if he wanted to, he would share how he thought the vote should go. Everybody knows that. But everybody has to depend on the fact that he is objective. He just is going to talk about the rules. These are the rules. This is what the rules say. Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, this is what they are. Now, as far as me communicating to a chairperson in a virtual meeting, there are various ways to do it. The organizations that I work with virtually, technically typically what I'll do is we're in a meeting just like this. We're in a Zoom meeting, and I'm blanked out. I just have my name up there, and I might have parliamentarian, but you don't see me. I stay in the backdrop, but everybody knows I'm there. And then what I'll do is I'll set up a direct line, cell phone to cell phone, to the chairperson, and I will communicate that way. Now, if you are listening to a meeting of city council, while we've been meeting virtually, you may hear the president say, "Excuse me just a second, the parliamentarian is calling me or getting my attention." She'll pause for a second, she and I will talk, and then she'll come back to you and to the meeting. What we have arranged is that while the meeting is going on, she and I and the clerk have a three-way call, and it's active. All I have to do is hit unmute and say, "Madam President," and she will stop, and she'll tell the meeting. She'll say, "Excuse me, the parliamentarian wants to speak to me," and then she and I'll speak, and then she'll go back. But it's an active line, and so it's automatically going the whole time. Or the clerk and I will have a quick conversation, or the clerk will speak to the president. So it's a three-way call that's active the whole time. That's how we work that out in virtual meetings. I don't know if that answered your questions.
No, it didn't. Because
didn't.
my main question was, how can I advise the chairperson if I'm muted and I'm not unmuted? You just stated how you three-way and come back and said the parliamentarian had something to say. So my question is, how can a parliamentarian speak or advise in a virtual meeting the chairman on what's being heard through the body when you're muted?
Okay, so first of all, if you're going to speak to the meeting, if the facilitator has the power to mute you or unmute you, that needs to be. If you're the parliamentarian and they want you to speak to the meeting, and I'm going to address that here in just a moment. If they want you to speak to the meeting, I recommend that you have the power to unmute yourself, because if you do that, or to be able to communicate in chat to the facilitator quickly, I need to speak. I need to speak to the meeting. That's an option too. Now, let me remind you, I'm not a tech person, so there might be options that are getting by me, but these are options that I've seen used and that I've practiced myself. The reason, and so I hope I'm answering your question. The reason that I keep a direct line to the president instead of just speaking to the meeting is because typically the parliamentarian is the advisor to the presiding officer. As parliamentarian, I will speak to the meeting if I'm requested to, and I have done that, but it should be rare, and it really should be rare. So let's suppose that instead of me having a direct line, and we had this discussion, let's suppose that instead of having a direct line to the president where I can get her attention and speak to her privately, let's suppose that instead of that, I just speak to the meeting. So let's say we're in a city council meeting, and there's debate ensuing, and Madam President is presiding over the meeting and guiding debate. I see a misstep, so I unmute myself and I tell the whole meeting, in front of the whole meeting, I say, "Madam President, a word," or "Madam President, you can't, that's out of order," or "Madam President, that's not proper procedure." What I've just done is I've spoken to the president of city council publicly and corrected the president of city council publicly. Even if I'm tactful, it still comes across that way. So if the president says, well, I hear you, but I think you're mistaken, I'm going to go another direction, and they have that authority, they need to have that authority, then it looks like, well, why do we need a parliamentarian? And there is great value in having a parliamentarian, not just because that's what I do, but that's why there are parliamentarians. Or if the president says, oh, thank you, Mr. Parliamentarian, I'm going to adjust. And then I do it again later on in the meeting. Madam President, that's improper procedure. You need to adjust, or I wouldn't put it that way. I'd say, Madam President, that's improper procedure. The proper approach is this. And then she says it again. Okay, thank you, Mr. Parliamentarian, I'll adjust. Now what it looks like is like I'm running the meeting from behind the scenes. And in either case, it's an unfortunate picture. In either case, the optics aren't good. The parliamentarian is supposed to be as discreet as possible, knowing full well by everyone that I am communicating to the chair, but I'm an advisor. And if the chair leans back and we're talking, and then the chair leans back forward and then proceeds with the meeting, that chairperson may or may not follow my advice. And if we're doing our job well, then the room may or may not know. And that's the ideal arrangement. So I don't know. I still don't know if I've answered your question for sure. Talk to a tech person and find out the best way to communicate with, if you're the parliamentarian, to communicate with the chair, see what the electronic options are. I've typed in the chat room to communicate with the chairperson before. I'm not a fast typist, so that wasn't effective.
Okay, Mr. Chelman, you can ask your question.
Thank you. I guess going back to the use of the timer, can that one be used as if I were the timer, separate from the chair? Can I use that and have it be unmuted all the time so everybody can hear that 30-second warning and then go back and then the last 3-minute warning? Or is that improper? I should direct it right to the chairperson.
Well, if you're keeping time, let me go to that's legitimate. Let me go to the city council meeting. The reason I use it a lot is because you're all members, you're all citizens of Atlanta, and perhaps you've been involved in the city council meetings. If you go in person to a city council meeting, you're going to see a big clock up on the right and up on the left. And as soon as somebody approaches the podium, a citizen approaches the podium, that clock starts ticking. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, when you get to the 30 seconds, that's kind of probably where I came up with 30 seconds. When you get to the 30-second mark, there's a bell that goes off, letting them know that they have 30 seconds left. As I understand it, if I remember right, because the clerk and I have had this conversation, I believe his office is running the timer. And so that's just something that the city council's decided is a good job, is a good idea. And your organization should make that determination, or at least the leadership, whether or not it would be helpful to have the timer in front of everybody while it's going. It may or may not be. It really depends on the organization. But city council does it. It seems to be very effective.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Ms. Hawkins, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. Hey, thank you, Mr. Conway. The
Yes.
speaker who was just before the last individual, is not there an option to be made co-host? And in doing so, you can private message certain individuals. I'm not quite certain. Like I noticed today, in the chat, it's everybody and or all of the hosts. So that one of the remedies for the muted individual is to be able to directly communicate with whomever is delineated as co-hosts, whatever correction and or support that they are providing. Is that not one measure? And the other measure, I guess the question I would ask is, seems like the point that you raised that I found invaluable was that relationship with the facilitator, whereby they see you as an advisor, a reliable advisor, and that they kind of welcome because they know you're there to advise, guide, and protect, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, I agree with you, and I'm glad you appreciated that. I think that is that is an important aspect that people need to recognize. We're not running things from behind the scenes. We're just in the ear. We're just whispering suggestions and ideas. This is what procedure says. And but as far as the co-host aspect of Zoom, I would want to toss that to Ms. Terry or somebody that knows more about Zoom and the technical aspects because that's getting out of my area of expertise. I typically do a lot of Zoom meetings, but I don't design any of them. I don't set them up. I haven't set up the first Zoom meeting that I can think of. I'm invited to be a part of them and I speak, but other people are in control. So I don't have the experience or the knowledge of the technical aspect.
Join the post-millennial club.
And my kids are never here for me to ask them, so.
So, Mrs. Hawkins, what we can do, because that's not my ministry as well. I can ask Tony on our team because he's been very effective with Zoom. So I can forward that question to him and then we get back to you.
We don't have similar issues in my NPU. I was just, because I noticed that there's ways of private messaging the individuals rather than having whatever your chat message is to everyone, and that could be an alternative to communicating with the facility. It seems like it was the most easy and straightforward.
Yeah, it's automatic on here. So I don't even think you actually have to set it up. As long as you have a chat room host or the co-host. So Mr. Conway is a co-host. So if everyone who's an officer is made a co-host, then they are able to receive direct messages. So maybe I did. Yay.
Let me jump in real quickly, if I may. That feature is controlled by the host of the meeting. So the host can actually change it so that people in the meeting can only chat with the hosts or co-hosts, or that they can only chat publicly and with hosts and co-hosts. Or it could be set up like Tony set this one up, where it's a free-for-all. Anyone can chat with anyone privately or publicly. So it's the answer is that the settings are determined by the host.
Thank you, Lee.
Yes, ma'am.
I think that was our last question.
We do
Okay.
have one question from the chat from Mr. Martin. Does the parliamentarian count towards quorum if he is a member of the body?
Yes. Yes, the answer is simple. He or she will count toward the quorum if he's a member of the body, or she.
And that was the last question in the chat.
All right. I have one more paragraph to read, and then I'll be done unless there's more. It's the final note. Ultimately, in every case, the organizational structure and design on committees and debate is in the hands of the voting assembly. That's so important to recognize. You have, if you're a voting member of the organization, you have all the authority in the world to make a recommendation. And if you get a second, to speak practically, then you're on your way to maybe providing some help for your organization regarding rules and procedure and regarding committees and so on. There's no reason why the assembly should not be organized the way it sees fit. Although if and when the voting assembly decides it wishes to make adjustments in its organization and structure, it should proceed in an organized and equitable fashion. So sometimes I put it that way because sometimes after a discussion like this, we want to go back to our organization and really spearhead some changes. Even still, we want to be calm and respectful and orderly and go forward properly and earn and show all the due respect of all the other members in the organization. Just something to remember. And that's all I have, unless there are other questions.
I think that's actually it. Does anyone have any more questions for Mr. Conway?
Motion to call the question.
Mr. Martin?
I'm sure glad he did that. Somebody needed to.
Raise your hand.
Well, I kind of do, Ms. Terry, in that what the question Jim raised as to whether or not the parliamentarian counted as quorum, as part of the quorum, it doesn't quite make sense if they're an eligible voter.
I don't guess I understand, Ms. Hawkins.
Meaning, what you outlined earlier is that they're unable to vote except if it's by a ballot, an amount of a ballot secure. What you said earlier is that I thought what you said is the parliamentarian is an ineligible voter in the process.
Unless it is by ballot.
Yeah, but if
Because
they're ineligible, that's kind of why I question whether their attendance adds as a member of quorum, because they're ineligible under most circumstances.
well,
Most-
the default,
Go ahead.
the default position is that they, being a member, would add to the quorum if would be part of constituting the quorum. If you have 100 members and you need a majority to have a quorum, and you have 51 people there, one of them being the parliamentarian, you have a quorum. That is just the way it's set up. But remember, the parliamentarian has the authority to vote. And if the parliamentarian is not a recognized member of the organization, he or she can't do that. And so parliamentary rule and procedure stipulates, and it says it right up front, in Robert's Rules of Order, it says it as a qualifying statement. The parliamentarian, if parliamentarian is a member of the organization and he or she's been nominated to take on that position, they need to know right up front, these are my words, they need to know right up front that they will not be able to engage in debate or voice votes. If they're willing to sacrifice that aspect of their membership, then there's a green light there to accept the nomination for parliamentarian and accept the election should they win. So, but the organization, this last paragraph that I read spoke to that. The organization has the authority to stipulate anything it wants under the law. The organization could make the rule that says, if you're the parliamentarian, you are not counted in the quorum. And they could just do that. And that if they wanted to do that, that's fine. It's their right. There are ex officio members of organizations, ex officio members of boards, and typically they're not counted in the quorum, but when they show up, they can function just like a regular member. So it would be along that same principle. But short of that taking place in a special rule that the organization puts forth, then they are counted in the quorum.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Okay. Well, if we don't.
Mr. Martin has his hand up,
Okay.
and then Ms. Actually, no, Ms. Powell is first, and then Mr. Martin.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Conway. This was very helpful to me. It helped clarify a lot of things for me and change my perspective and defined brought a lot of clarity for me. And I just wanted to thank Leah and the team at the MPU. This was very helpful. I think we're lucky to have you in our MPU. So thank you. And this was very enjoyable.
So glad to hear. So glad to hear. Thank you.
Ms. Hawkins?
Oh, and my hand up? No, I didn't want my hand up.
Okay.
Those are clappy hands like Mr. Martin.
So if that is it, hold on, go to my last screen. Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for participating and sticking it out with us. This is actually our longest course, but you can see why. This is a very big deal. I'm trying to make the screen, again, user error. I'm trying to make the screen expand and it will not allow it.
Slideshow.
I know that deal. Okay. 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 So our upcoming NPU University courses include WB 1004.001 Zoning Fundamentals 1, which is March 16th at 6 p.m. WB 1018 Workforce Development, which we actually we postponed last year, so it will be one of our new courses for this year. Thursday, April 8th at 6 p.m. and WB 1004.002 Zoning Fundamentals 2, Tuesday, April 20th at 6 p.m. If you would like to register, please visit www.npuatlanta.org. And oh no. You can follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at NPU Atlanta, and on Nextdoor at City of Atlanta Neighborhood Planning Units. Also, all of you all will be receiving an email with the survey. Please, please, please take the time, fill it out. It's only about 5 questions. And when you did your pre-registration, we received your mailing addresses and everything. Okay, yes, we know your NPUs and everything, so disregard. So please, please, please fill out those surveys. We want to make sure that our next courses will be accurate and have answered the questions that you point out and things like that. So if there aren't any more questions, this will end the course. Bye, guys.
Good to see you,
Ms. Terry,
Samantha.
thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm sure enjoyed being with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Good to see you.
Likewise.